Hey, welcome back. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found your way to this little corner of the night. And if you have been here before, well, you already know the drill. Get comfortable, stretch those legs, fluff that pillow. Tonight we're going somewhere together. Picture this. It is England. The year is 1882. The sun has just dipped below the rooftops of a quiet London street, and a woman, let us call her Margaret, steps outside her front door. She's not going to the market. She's not visiting a neighbour. She's not running an errand for her husband. She's simply walking. And here is the wild part. That one quiet, solitary walk in the cool evening air was the most radical thing she would do all week. Now, before we travel back together to that long-lost world, I just want to say, if tonight's story moves you, if it makes you see something differently, if it makes you feel something you did not expect to feel while lying in the dark, hit that subscribe button, drop a like or leave a little comment down below. Tell me where you are right now. Are you in bed already? Curled up on the couch? Maybe listening while the city hums outside your window? I love knowing where these stories find you. You do not have to do anything, but if you enjoy what I bring to you here, that small gesture means the world, and it helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Now, dim the lights as low as they will go, let the night air settle around you, and let's step back 140 years into a world that was beautiful and suffocating, and full of women who found extraordinary ways to breathe. There is something almost forgotten about the Victorian era that most people get completely wrong. When we imagine Victorian women, we tend to picture two things: either the grand, glamorous lady of leisure draped in silk, sipping tea in a drawing room completely at ease, or the tragic corseted prisoner, pale and breathless, trapped by a society that wanted her small and still. And the truth, it was both of those things, and neither of them all at the same time. Because the real story of Victorian women, the one that most history books gloss right over, is the story of what happened in the hours between. The hours between duty and sleep. The hours when the day's work was done, the dinner was cleared, the children were put to bed, and a woman finally had a few stolen moments that belonged entirely to her. And for hundreds of thousands of women across England, America and Europe, those moments looked exactly the same. They laced up their boots, they pulled on their coats, and they walked out the door into the evening air. Now you might be thinking, okay, walking. That is not exactly revolutionary. People walk every day. I walked to my fridge 3 times today, and I did not feel particularly liberated. Fair point. But here is what you have to understand about a Victorian woman's relationship with time. She did not have much of it that was truly hers. According to Isabella Beeton's book of household management, published in 1861 and treated by many middle-class households almost like a sacred text, a respectable wife and mother was expected to begin managing her household from the moment she woke up. And I mean the moment. Beeton's instructions were, let us say, enthusiastic. The mistress of the house was to rise early enough to organise the servants, check the pantry plan, the meals oversee the cleaning, manage the household accounts, attend to correspondence, supervise the children's lessons, receive visitors during the afternoon, calling hours which were rigidly scheduled between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, by the way, and you could not arrive a minute early or a minute late without raising eyebrows, and then prepare herself to be a charming, composed presence at dinner. And that was on a calm day, on a day when nothing went wrong, when the cook did not burn anything, when no one was sick, when no unexpected visitors arrived. Every hour from waking to dinner was accounted for. Every hour had its purpose, its expectation, its social weight. And even the leisure activities available to her, embroidery, piano practice, watercolour painting, reading poetry, were not really leisure in the way we understand the word. They were performance. They were evidence of feminine accomplishment. They were things she did so that her husband could feel proud, so that visitors could admire, so that society could see she was properly refined. Even her relaxation was for someone else's benefit. So when did she get to just be? This is the question that researchers studying Victorian women's diaries and journals have found themselves returning to again and again. And the answer that keeps emerging from those faded handwritten pages is startlingly consistent: the evening, after dinner. In that quiet, uncertain hour before full dark, when the day's obligations had technically concluded, but the night had not yet swallowed everything that was her time. A scholar publishing research through Cambridge University's Victorian Literature and Culture Journal studied a large collection of manuscript diaries written by ordinary 19th century English women and found something remarkable. Walking appears in those diaries constantly, not just occasionally, constantly. Some women recorded their walks almost every single day with the same casual, matter-of-fact tone they might use to note the weather. Nothing particular today. I went for a walk. I walked alone and enjoyed it much. Went a long walk through a beautiful part of the country. What strikes researchers about these entries is how utterly unremarkable walking seemed to the women themselves. They were not writing about rebellion. They were not patting themselves on the back for their boldness. They were simply noting what they did the way you might note that you had a good lunch. And yet when you look at the society around them, you begin to realize just how significant that simple daily act really was. Here is the world these women were walking through. In Victorian England, particularly in the middle classes that defined so much of the era's cultural tone, a woman's relationship with public space was complicated in ways that are hard to fully grasp today. The ideal Victorian woman was not supposed to be out in the world very much at all. She was, in the language of the time, a creature of the domestic sphere. The home was her domain, her kingdom, her purpose. The world outside the streets, the markets, the coffee houses, the parks, the political meetings, all of that belonged to men. This was not just a social custom, it was backed by law. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, a woman's money, her property, her income, everything she owned legally became her husband's upon marriage. She could not open a bank account in her own name. She could not sign a contract without her husband's approval. In the eyes of English law, a married woman was not quite a full legal person. She was something closer to a dependent, an extension of her husband's identity, and the physical world reflected this reality in quiet, persistent, everyday ways. A woman seen walking alone on a city street, especially in the evening, especially without a clear, respectable destination, was immediately suspect. What was she doing out there? Who was she meeting? Was she that kind of woman? The judgment was swift. The whispers were real. And for middle-class women for whom reputation was everything, the difference between social acceptance and social destruction, those whispers were genuinely frightening. And yet, they still walked. Diaries, letters, novels, newspaper accounts from the period tell us the same story over and over. Victorian women walked. They walked in the mornings when they had a plausible errand to run. They walked in the afternoons when it could be framed as a social visit to a friend. And they walked in the evenings, perhaps most powerfully, perhaps most meaningfully, in that liminal hour when the day was ending and the light was going soft and gold and then fading to grey. Because the evening had something the rest of the day did not. The evening had a kind of permission built into it. At that hour the official social rounds were over, the calling hours were done, the respectable visiting was finished, the formal performances of the day had concluded, and in that particular quiet, that domestic exhale, a woman could step outside and no one could quite say what she was supposed to be doing instead. There was no expectation she was breaking, no appointment she was missing, no role she was abandoning. She was simply between. And between, it turns out, is one of the most powerful places a person can be. Think about what it must have felt like. You've been inside all day. not in the trapped claustrophobic way we imagine when we think of Victorian households, because these were often large, comfortable homes with gardens and light and perfectly decent rooms. But inside in a different way. Inside a role, inside a performance, inside the constant low-level hum of being watched and judged and measured against an impossible standard. And then the sun begins to set. The children are finally quiet. The dinner plates have been cleared. Your husband has retreated to his study or his club or his newspaper, and you pull on your coat, and you step outside, and the air hits your face. Cool, real, moving. And for the first time all day, for the first time since you woke up inside your role and began performing it, you're just a body moving through space. No one is watching you do it correctly. No one is grading your posture. No one needs anything from you right now. You are just walking. There is a name for this kind of walk, by the way. Victorian society actually gave it a name which tells you something important about how common it was. They called it the constitutional, the evening constitutional. The word itself is quietly remarkable. Constitutional as in good for the constitution, good for the health, good for the body. It was a medically respectable reason to be outside, and Victorian women who are, as we will explore much more deeply in the chapters ahead, constantly navigating a medical establishment that had very strong opinions about what their bodies could and could not handle, understood instinctively the power of having a doctor-approved reason to exist in the public world. You were not wandering, you were not loitering, you were not being conspicuous or improper, you were taking your constitutional. It was prescribed, it was sensible, it was almost impossible to argue with. And underneath that perfectly respectable medical language, something else was happening entirely. But I want to pause here just for a moment, because before we go any deeper into the world of Victorian evening walks, before we talk about what those walks meant, what they gave women, what dangers they held, what freedoms they unlocked, I want to make sure you understand something about the women we're talking about. They were not waiting to be rescued. This is the thing that gets lost when we tell history from the outside, when we look at a world full of restrictions and think those poor women, how trapped they were, how limited. And yes, the restrictions were real. The legal inequality was real. The social surveillance was real. But the women inside that world were not passive. They were not simply waiting for someone to arrive and liberate them. They were navigating. They were reading the rules of their world carefully, intelligently, precisely, and finding the places where those rules had gaps, where they had loopholes, where they bent just a little if you pushed in exactly the right way. And the evening constitutional was one of those loopholes. It was the gap between the rules. It was the breath between the sentences. It was the hour that society had not quite figured out how to legislate yet. And Victorian women, being as humans always are clever and resourceful and hungry, for something that was simply theirs, they found it. And they used it. Every single evening. Lady Elizabeth Ingleby, whose diary entries have been preserved and studied by historians, wrote again and again about her walks. She noted them the way other women noted meals or visitors, quietly, consistently, with a kind of contained satisfaction. I took a turn alone. I walked alone and enjoyed it much. That second phrase is worth sitting with for a moment. I walked alone and enjoyed it much. Not, I walked alone though I know I should not have. Not I walked alone hoping no one would notice. Just I walked alone and I enjoyed it. The pleasure was plain and unapologetic. The solitude was something she sought, not something she endured. And she wrote it down knowing that her husband might well read that diary, and she let it stand. I walked alone and enjoyed it much. Now, we're only at the beginning of this story. Because the evening walk was not just a walk. It was not just a brief, pleasant escape from the domestic routine. What those women were doing when they laced up their boots and stepped outside, what they were really doing underneath the perfectly reasonable surface of taking their constitutional, was something far more complex, far more layered, and far more extraordinary than it appears at first glance. In the hours and chapters ahead, we're going to follow those women through their world. We're going to look at the extraordinary apparatus of rules, medical, legal, social, sartorial, that was built to keep them still and small and quiet. We're going to meet the women who pushed back, not always loudly, not always in ways that history noticed or celebrated, but persistently, quietly. One evening walk at a time, we're going to step inside the twilight hour, that strange, soft, almost magical time of day that gave Victorian women something the bright midday never could. We're going to discover what those boots actually felt like to wear, what the streets actually smelled like, what the gaslit corners of an 1880 London evening actually looked and sounded like. And we're going to ask a question that turns out to be surprisingly moving. What does it mean to claim a single hour in a day that has been given entirely to someone else? What does it mean to walk out a door and breathe air that belongs to no one? What does it mean to feel the ground beneath your feet and know that for now, for just this moment, you are going nowhere in particular, and that is exactly the point. Those women knew the answer, and tonight together, so will we. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, let the evening come to you the way it came to them softly, slowly from the edges of the day, and let's keep walking together. Something I keep thinking about every time I read about this era is how much we misunderstand the corset. We've all seen it in movies. The dramatic scene where a woman grabs the bedpost and a maid yanks the laces from behind, cinching and squeezing until the woman gasps. It is almost theatrical. And like a lot of theatrical things, it is partially true and mostly misleading. Because the corset was not just a torture device. It was not just a symbol of oppression. It was something far more complicated, far more interesting, and honestly far more revealing about the world Victorian women actually lived in. And here is the thing about that world that I want you to really sit with tonight. Before a Victorian woman could take her evening walk, before she could feel the air on her face, and enjoy even 1 minute of that fragile stolen freedom, she had to get dressed. And getting dressed in 1882 was its own kind of ordeal. Let me walk you through it, not as a fashion lesson, but as a physical experience. Because I think when you feel it in your body, really feel it, everything else about this story lands differently. It is morning. You wake up in your bedroom. The first thing you reach for is not coffee. It is your chemise, a long, thin linen undergarment that goes over everything else so that your clothes never actually touch your skin. Over the chemise you put on your corset, made of whalebone or steel, and later in the decade increasingly of the new industrially produced steel boning that could be laced dramatically tighter than anything that came before. The desired waist circumference at the height of tight-lacing fashion in the early 1880s was somewhere between 17 and 20 inches. To give you a sense of scale, the smallest waist size listed by most modern clothing stores today is roughly 23 or 24 inches, so we're talking about a waist compressed to a size that most modern women's bodies simply do not naturally have. Now here is where I want to nuance something, because the history is actually more interesting than the myth. Historians who have studied surviving Victorian corsets and dresses have pointed out that most women probably did not achieve the extreme 17-inch waists that fashion illustrations depicted. Fashion plates then as now were aspirational. They were the Instagram filters of their day. Most women likely cinched down 3 or 4 inches from their natural measurements, which is significant and genuinely physically restrictive, but not the body-destroying instrument of legend. A researcher named Colleen Ruby Gow, who studied women wearing 1870s-style corsets in clinical conditions, found that lacing down 3 inches caused subjects to lose on average 9% of their breathing capacity. 9%. Not debilitating, but real and constant. Every breath all day slightly shallower than it would naturally be. Every movement, every stair climbed every errand run with 9% less air. But we're not done getting dressed. Over the corset goes the corset cover. Then the bustle in the 1880s. This was a dramatic contraption of wire coils or ruffled padding tied around the waist and projecting from the back, creating that distinctive shelf-like silhouette you see in paintings of the era. Georges Seurat painted it brilliantly in his famous work from 1884 to 1886. A Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte, where the women in the park move through filtered light with their geometric bustles jutting behind them like small architectural features. Then comes a petticoat, then the skirt, then the boned bodice, possibly a jacket if it is cold, perhaps trimmed with jet beads. And here is the number I want you to remember. In 1881, a journalist investigating women's clothing went to a department store in New York and weighed the garments women were actually wearing on the street. A single plain winter skirt of cloth 12 pounds, a felt underskirt 8 to 10 pounds, a jacket with jet bead trimming up to 10 additional pounds. The full winter outfit of a fashionable middle-class woman from corset to outer jacket could weigh as much as 25 pounds. 25 pounds. That is roughly equivalent to strapping a moderately sized dog to yourself every single morning and then going about your day, receiving visitors, managing the household, and yes, going for your evening constitutional. Can I just pause here for a second? Because I want to ask you something, and I genuinely mean this. Have you ever tried to go for a walk, even a normal modern walk, when you were uncomfortable? Maybe you were wearing the wrong shoes. Maybe your back was hurting. Maybe you had eaten too much or not enough, or you were just tired in that deep way that settles into your bones. And even in that state, even uncomfortable, you went. Because something about walking, something about moving your body through open air was more important than the discomfort. That is what these women were doing, every single evening, in 25 pounds of clothing, with 9% less air in their lungs, on cobblestone streets in leather boots with pointed toes and heels that a doctor of the time called quite specifically impossible for walking with grace or ease. They walked anyway. They walked because the alternative, remaining inside, still remaining within the walls of the role they performed all day, was worse than the discomfort. That tells you everything you need to know about how much that walk meant to them. Now, I want to spend some time with the corset itself because it is one of the great misunderstood objects of history. Here is the common narrative men forced women into corsets. Women hated them but had no choice. They were straightforwardly an instrument of control. And here is what the historical record actually shows. It is messier than that. Much messier. Yes, there was an enormous social pressure on women to achieve the fashionable silhouette. Yes, mothers began corseting their daughters in childhood. Some girls wore them as young as 4 or 5 years old, their growing bodies slowly shaped by the garment from the very beginning. Yes, medical professionals raised increasingly loud alarms about the health consequences. A pamphlet published in 1892 called Fashion Slaves warned with considerable drama that if women continued corseting, the human race must inevitably deteriorate, which is quite a sentence. The race will deteriorate because of underwear. Victorian medical discourse did not do subtle, but here is what the simplistic narrative misses. Many women chose the corset, actively, enthusiastically, not because they had been brainwashed, but because the corset did something real for them. It provided genuine back support in an era before ergonomic chairs. It allowed women of modest means to achieve the narrow-waisted silhouette that had previously been the exclusive province of the wealthy a kind of democratization of fashion, driven by the mass production that the Industrial Revolution made possible. And for some women it was simply how a dressed body felt. They had worn corsets since early childhood. The sensation of the garment was the sensation of being clothed, of being put together, of being ready to face the world. Fashion historian Valerie Steele, who wrote what is arguably the most thorough academic study of the corset, argued that many of the male physicians who railed most loudly against the corset were doing so for reasons that had less to do with women's health than with their own discomfort at how the corset shaped the female body. The condemnation of corsets, she noted, was often delivered in the same breath as condemnations of female sexuality and female autonomy, which makes you think. So we have this complicated object, this garment that shaped, supported, restricted, and signified simultaneously, that was chosen and imposed, desired and endured all at once. And it sat at the very centre of a Victorian woman's physical relationship with her own body. Now here is the part I find genuinely fascinating. When the women who are beginning to push back against the most restrictive elements of their world, the women who would eventually become the rational dress reformers, the suffragists, the new women of the 1890s, when those women began to articulate what they wanted to change, the corset was always near the top of the list, not because they all hated it, but because they recognized quite clearly what it represented. In 1881, the Rational Dress Society was founded in London. Its founding principle was that women's clothing should not deform the figure, impede the movements, or injure the health. The language is simple: should not deform, should not impede, should not injure. Three things that in 1881 a woman's ordinary daily clothing was arguably doing all three of simultaneously. The Rational Dress Society did not have an enormous immediate impact on what most women wore. Fashion moves slowly, social norms move even slower, but it planted something, a language, a framework for talking about women's bodies as things that deserved to move freely, that deserved air, that deserved the full use of their own lungs. And this is where the evening walk comes back in, because it was not separate from these larger conversations. It was in a quiet way part of them. Think about what happens to a body when it walks. The chest opens, the stride lengthens, the breath deepens or tries to within whatever space the corset permits. The muscles of the back, the legs, the arms engage, blood moves, oxygen circulates. The brain, which has been doing the subtle, exhausting work of social performance all day, begins to release. For a Victorian woman in a 25-pound outfit with slightly compressed lungs, a walk was not nothing. It was in the most literal physical sense a recovery. Her body was reclaiming something, not dramatically, not consciously perhaps, but in the basic animal language of movement and breath. Her body was saying, "This is mine. These steps, this air, this moment, this is mine." There is something else worth knowing about Victorian women's clothing that complicates the picture even further. The clothes were not the same all day. This is something that surprises people who are not deep into the history. A middle-class Victorian woman had different clothes for different parts of the day. Morning dress, afternoon visiting dress, evening dress, walking dress. And the walking dress, specifically the dress designed for outdoor walking, was actually engineered with the standards of the time for movement. By the mid-1880s, walking dresses had been designed with slightly shorter hemlines to keep the skirt from dragging on the muddy London streets. The trains that swept dramatically behind evening and reception gowns were shortened or eliminated. The skirts, while still substantial, were often reinforced with internal tapes and ties, so they moved with the body rather than against it. There was even a subset of particularly practical women influenced by the rational dress movement, who began wearing what were called reform undergarments, lighter petticoats, corsets, with more elastic panels, chemises that distributed weight more evenly across the shoulders rather than letting it all hang from the hips. The Emancipation Union under flannel, patented in 1868, was one early attempt to redesign underwear for actual human movement. These were not radical enough to transform things overnight, but they were a beginning. And every evening when a woman laced on her walking boots and reached for her lighter walking coat instead of her formal gown, even that small choice was a tiny act of negotiation with the world that dressed her. I find myself thinking sometimes about what it would feel like to have your own body be a public statement, to dress every morning knowing that every element of your appearance, your waist, your silhouette, your posture, was being read by everyone around you as evidence of your character, your class, your virtue. Too tight a corset and you were vain, too loose and you were slovenly, wrong silhouette and you were lower class, wrong shoes and you were not respectable. Every day just getting dressed was a negotiation with a society that had decided it had opinions about your body. And then you went outside, and people looked, and they judged, and you carried all of that, the weight of the fabric, the weight of the gaze, the weight of the expectation through your entire day. And then the sun went down, and you pulled on your walking coat, and you stepped outside, and something loosened. Not the corset stayed exactly where it was, but something else, something less physical and more essential, something in the chest that is not the lungs but acts like them, something that had been held tight all day finally blessedly got a little room to breathe. The dress reformers of the 1880s and 1890s understood this connection instinctively. They argued loudly and repeatedly that you cannot separate what a woman wears from how she thinks. That clothing is not decoration. Clothing is architecture. It shapes the space a person can move through. It expands or constricts not just the body but the imagination. And if you dress a woman from childhood in garments that require her to move carefully, sit carefully, breathe carefully, you're training her whether you mean to or not in the art of taking up less space. That is a lesson that goes far deeper than fashion. That is a lesson about selfhood. And the women who walked out their doors every evening in their heavy skirts and their firm corsets and their pointed boots were in some fundamental way refusing that lesson, not by taking off the corset, not by burning the bustle, but simply by moving, by insisting one footfall at a time that they were bodies that deserved to be in motion, that the space beyond the front door belonged to them as much as anyone, that the evening air was free. Something I read stays with me from a physician named Dr. Mary Jacobi, one of the first women to graduate from the Paris School of Medicine, and a remarkable figure in her own right. Speaking about women's clothing and physical health in the early 1880s, she made an observation that I think cuts straight to the heart of everything we're talking about tonight. She said that heavy clothing that hangs from the waist interferes with muscular activity, and that for women hampered by their dress walking is less valuable than it otherwise would be. Less valuable, not valueless, less, even with 25 pounds of fabric, even with a corset compressing the lungs, even with pointed boots on cobblestones. The walk was still valuable, still worth doing, still something a woman's body needed and wanted, and despite every obstacle society could pile on top of it, still went out to find every evening. I think about that a lot, the sheer stubbornness of it, the very human refusal to let the obstacles, however real, however heavy, be the final word. But here is what I have not told you yet. Here is what we're just now beginning to approach. The corset and the clothing were the physical architecture of restriction, but they were not the whole story, because there was another architecture, an invisible one, made not of whalebone and steel, but of medical theory, social rule, and a centuries-old idea about what a woman's body could and could not safely be asked to do. And in the 1870s and 1880s, that invisible architecture was reaching its most elaborate, most confident, most genuinely astonishing peak. The doctors had decided, you see. They had decided with great authority and many published papers what female bodies were capable of, and their conclusions were extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that when you hear it today makes you want to laugh and then immediately feel sad about how many women lived inside those conclusions. What they believed, what they prescribed, what they forbade, and how the evening walk fit, or rather how women made it fit into a medical landscape that would have preferred they stayed still. That is where we are headed next. And I promise you it is stranger and more remarkable than anything you're probably expecting. Right around the year 1869, a doctor in New York named George Miller Beard sat down and wrote an article that would quietly reshape how Victorian society thought about women's bodies for the next 3 decades. The article appeared in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, the same publication that would eventually become the New England Journal of Medicine. And what Beard proposed in those pages was on the surface a perfectly reasonable-sounding medical theory. He called it neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion. The idea was this modern civilization was advancing so rapidly, the telegraph, the railroad, the factory system, the relentless pace of industrial city life, that it was depleting people's nervous energy at a rate the human body simply was not designed to sustain. Reasonable, right. We have all felt something like that. The sense that the world is moving faster than we can keep up with, the deep cellular tiredness that no amount of sleep quite fixes. Beard put a name on it, and then here is where it gets interesting. He explained who suffered from it most. According to Beard, neurasthenia was overwhelmingly a disease of the refined, of the educated, of the sensitive. It struck above all middle and upper-class women, because their nervous systems, he argued, were simply more delicate than men's, more susceptible to overstimulation, more easily depleted by the demands of modern life. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, wait, but middle-class Victorian women were not exactly running corporations or commanding armies in 1870. They were managing households, and you would be right to notice that. Because the particular cruelty of the neurasthenia diagnosis was that it had nothing to do with how much a woman was actually doing. It had to do with what she was. The theory held that women by their biological nature had a limited reserve of nervous energy, and if too much of that energy was directed toward intellectual pursuits, toward reading, writing, studying, thinking seriously about anything beyond the domestic sphere, it would be drained away from the reproductive system, from the uterus, from the essential feminine function, and the woman would become sick, exhausted, hysterical, broken, just by thinking too hard. I want to pause here because this is important. This was not fringe pseudoscience. This was mainstream, respected, published medical thinking, taught at universities, practiced by the most prominent physicians in America and England. Beard's book on the subject went through multiple editions and was translated into German and French. His ideas crossed the Atlantic and spread through the medical establishment like a very confident disease, and women who arrived at their doctors feeling exhausted, anxious, depressed, unable to sleep, which honestly, given their lives, makes complete sense, were told that what they needed was rest. Not the ordinary rest of a good night's sleep, something much more radical, something much more total. Something that when you read about it today makes you go very quiet for a moment. Enter a man named Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a Philadelphia neurologist, a Civil War veteran who had spent years treating soldiers with catastrophic nerve damage, a writer of poetry and fiction on the side, and from the 1870s onward the most prominent practitioner of what he called the rest cure. Mitchell had observed that soldiers recovering from nerve injuries did better with enforced rest and rich feeding. he decided the same logic applied to women with nervous exhaustion, and so he built a treatment, an elaborate, strictly regimented 6 to 8 week treatment. Here is what it involved. Complete bed rest. No sitting up without assistance, no reading, no writing, no sewing, no intellectual activity of any kind, no visitors from family or friends, no contact with the outside world. In the most extreme cases, patients were not permitted to feed themselves or even turn over in bed without assistance. The doctor himself was the only authority figure in this sealed, silent world. Every meal a high-fat, high-calorie diet of milk and butter and bread and raw beef soup was regulated by Mitchell's instructions. Massage and electrotherapy were applied to prevent muscle atrophy, since the body was not moving at all, and the whole thing was expected to last minimum 6 weeks. 6 weeks of lying still, in silence, alone. Now, here is the question I keep coming back to. Can you imagine? Can you actually imagine being told by the most respected medical authority of your time, in the most authoritative possible tone, that the cure for your exhaustion and anxiety was to be confined to a room alone for 6 weeks, forbidden from reading or writing or seeing the people you love, that the thing making you sick was not the monotony and the isolation and the lack of agency in your life, but rather the dangerous excess of thought, that the solution was essentially to become as passive as possible, to do nothing, to be nothing, to simply lie there and eat and wait to be declared recovered. I find it genuinely difficult to imagine. And yet this was not the fringe. This was the treatment prescribed to some of the most accomplished women of the era. Jane Addams, the social reformer and future Nobel Prize winner, received the rest cure. Virginia Woolf was forced into versions of it multiple times, and a woman named Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer, a social thinker, a deeply intelligent and energetic person, received it at the hands of Mitchell himself in 1887. And what happened to her nearly broke her entirely. Gilman had gone to Mitchell suffering from depression following the birth of her daughter. Mitchell examined her, and he prescribed the full rest cure. She spent a month at his clinic confined, fed, massaged, and forbidden from using her mind. Then he sent her home with instructions. And those instructions, which she later wrote down and shared with the world, are, I think, some of the most remarkable words in the history of medicine. Mitchell told her to live as domestic a life as possible, to have her child with her at all times, to lie down for an hour after each meal, to allow herself no more than 2 hours of intellectual activity per day. And then this is the part: never touch pen brush or pencil as long as you live. Never, as long as you live. This was a doctor telling a writer that she must never write again, that the very act of creation, the thing that gave her life its shape and meaning, was the thing that was making her sick. She tried to follow the advice. For several months she tried, and she came, as she later wrote, perilously close to total mental collapse. She said she could see over the borderline of utter mental ruin, and she could see what was on the other side. What saved her was simple. She ignored him. She went back to work. She began writing again, and she got better. Not recovered in the way Mitchell would have understood, but better in the way that actually mattered, connected to herself, to her purpose, to the force of her own mind. And then she wrote a short story, published in 1891 in a magazine called the New England Magazine. A story about a woman undergoing the rest cure, confined to a room, forbidden from writing, slowly losing her grip on reality, becoming obsessed with the pattern in the yellow wallpaper, seeing a woman trapped behind it, peeling it away to free her. You almost certainly know the story. The yellow wallpaper. It is studied in college literature courses across the country. It is considered one of the foundational texts of American feminist writing. and it was written in direct response to what a doctor told Charlotte Perkins Gilman she must never do. Gilman sent a copy of the story to Mitchell himself. He never acknowledged receiving it, but she later heard from others that he had in fact altered his treatment of neurasthenia after reading it. Whether that is entirely true I cannot say for certain, but I like to think about it. The idea that a story written in defiance, in fury, in the narrow hours of mental life that were allowed, reached a man who had nearly destroyed its author and made him reconsider words as medicine. Not the medicine he would have prescribed, but medicine nonetheless. Now, here is the thing about this that connects directly back to our story. When Dr. Mitchell prescribed the rest cure for women, he was doing something very specific with movement. He was prescribing its total absence. And when he prescribed the West cure for men with the same diagnosis because men got a different treatment, which I think tells you everything he prescribed its excess, men with neurasthenia were sent west, outdoors, into physical activity. Theodore Roosevelt, diagnosed with nerve exhaustion, was told to go to the Badlands of Dakota and ride horses and do vigorous manly things, which he did, and which he later credited with transforming his health and his character. Walt Whitman received similar outdoor prescriptions. So, men with exhausted nerves go outside, move, breathe, ride horses. Women with exhausted nerves go to bed. Stop moving, stop thinking, stop writing. The difference is not subtle. The difference is not accidental. The difference is a complete philosophical statement about what male and female bodies were for. A man's body was for action. A woman's body was for reproduction. And any energy spent on anything else was energy stolen from her fundamental purpose. This is the invisible architecture I mentioned at the end of the last section. The one made not of steel and whalebone, but of theory and authority, and the absolute confidence of men who had decided in great detail what women's bodies could and could not safely do. And yet, the women kept walking. Not in most cases because they were consciously defying medical authority. Not because they had read a pamphlet about neurasthenia and decided Mitchell was wrong. Most of them had not even heard of the rest cure. They walked because their bodies told them to, because something in the core of them recognized that movement was not the problem. Movement was in fact quite close to the answer, that the headaches and the fatigue and the anxiety that looked to Victorian doctors like a nervous system collapsing under the weight of too much thought were in many cases the entirely predictable symptoms of lives that gave women too little freedom and far too little fresh air. And the evening constitutional, the quiet, daily, almost stubbornly ordinary act of walking out the front door was in some profound and inarticulate way exactly the right prescription. The body knew what the doctors did not, or rather the body knew what the doctors chose not to acknowledge. There is a detail from Dr. Mitchell's own writing that I find fascinating and honestly a little heartbreaking. In his clinical notes, he described his typical neurasthenic patient as thin, pale, lacking blood. He described one patient with a contempt that leaps off the page even 140 years later as a pallid, feeble creature who had no more bosom than the average chicken at a boarding house table. This was the leading expert on women's nervous health, writing this about his patient in his published work, and the women kept coming to him because he was the authority, because they had been taught to trust him, because in a world where women had no medical schools open to them, no journals that would publish their observations, no professional standing that would let them say, actually, I think you have this entirely backwards in that world. Dr. Mitchell's word was close to the final word, but not quite, because there were women pushing back, quietly, from the margins. Dr. Mary Putnam Jacobi, the same remarkable physician we met briefly in the last section, was one of the first women admitted to the Paris School of Medicine in a battle that consumed years of her life. And she spent much of her career doing something that the male medical establishment found deeply inconvenient. She published research, rigorous, careful, methodologically sound research that directly challenged the core assumption underlying the rest cure and the whole doctrine of female nervous fragility. She measured, she observed, she published data, and her data said, women's bodies are not inherently weaker than men's. Women's nervous systems are not inherently more depleted by intellectual activity. The symptoms being attributed to female biological weakness are in very many cases the symptoms of constricted lives, of insufficient exercise, of insufficient sleep, of insufficient mental freedom, of clothing that compresses the lungs, of social roles that compress the spirit. Jacobi was not famous in the way Mitchell was famous. She did not have his social connections, his confident manner, his decades of published authority. But she was right, and she was quietly, persistently, rigorously right. In a way that Mitchell, for all his brilliance and all his genuine belief that he was helping his patients, was not. What I find most moving about all of this, and I want to just sit with this for a moment because I think it deserves a moment, is what it reveals about the relationship between knowledge and power. Mitchell was not a villain. He was not, by the standards of his time, a bad man. He genuinely believed he was helping. He genuinely believed in his theory. He had built it from real observations, real clinical experience, real intellectual effort. And yet, he built it inside a world that had already decided before he arrived what women were, what they were capable of, what they deserved, and all of his intelligence and all of his careful observation could not quite see past that starting assumption. Because it was not a scientific assumption, it was a social one, dressed up in the language of science, given the authority of medicine, published in journals, practiced in clinics, prescribed to real women who sat in real rooms and stared at real walls for 6 weeks, trying to get well by staying perfectly obediently still, and every evening outside those clinic windows, and outside the drawing room windows, and outside the bedroom windows of the houses where women were told they were too fragile for the world. This street was there, the air was there. The last light of the day was fading over the rooftops, and some of those women got up anyway, put on their coats, laced up their boots, and walked, not in rebellion, not in any organized, theorized political way, just in the simple, ancient, utterly human way that a body chooses motion over stillness, that a spirit chooses open air over closed rooms, that a person, even a person told repeatedly that they are too delicate for the world, reaches for the door. But here is what I keep wondering about. What was it like in that specific hour, in that narrow slice between the daylight world and the night? What was it that happened to these women when they stepped outside? What did the evening actually give them that the rest of the day could not? We have been circling around that question since the beginning. And now we are close enough to walk directly into it. The twilight hour, the gaslit streets, the particular quality of light and silence that settled over Victorian London or Manchester or Edinburgh as the sun went down, and the strange, almost paradoxical freedom that the fading of the day seemed to offer to women who spent every waking hour being watched. What did that light do? What did that quiet give them? And why, of all the hours of the day, was it precisely the threshold between day and night that felt to so many Victorian women most profoundly like a space that belonged to them? That is where we go next, and it is, I promise you, one of the most quietly beautiful things we will discover in this whole story. So there we were at the end of the last section, standing at the threshold, the front door, that narrow rectangle of wood and glass and polished brass that separated the interior world of a Victorian woman's life from everything that existed outside of it. And I promised you something beautiful, I want to keep that promise. But first let me ask you something genuinely curious. Think about the last time you stepped outside at dusk. Not midday, not midnight. That particular hour when the sky cannot quite make up its mind, when the light is doing something extraordinary that it only does for 20 minutes, maybe 30 before it is gone completely. Did you feel something shift? Something almost imperceptible, like a change in pressure. A sense that the rules of the day, the schedules, the obligations, the performance of being yourself in front of other people had momentarily loosened their grip. If you have felt that even once, even vaguely, then you already understand something that Victorian women understood far more vividly than we do, because they had been waiting for exactly that moment all day, and they had very specific reasons why. Let's talk about the gaslight first, because the light is not a small detail here. The light is in many ways the whole story. By 1880, London had 1 million gas street lamps burning across 215 miles of streets. 1 million. The city had become so famous for the brightness of its illuminated streets that foreign visitors regularly wrote home in astonishment. And yet, here is the thing about gas lamps that photographs from the period cannot quite convey. The light they produced was not the flat, even surveillance-quality light of modern street lighting. It was warm, it was amber-toned. It pooled in circles on the pavement and left long stretches of shadow in between. The pools of light and the pools of darkness alternated down every street, creating a rhythm lit dark that you moved through rather than simply stood beneath. And in that alternating rhythm, something very interesting happened to visibility. You could be seen in the pools of light, and in the shadows between them you were to a meaningful degree simply not. This sounds like a minor thing. It was not. Victorian life was organised around being seen. I want to stay with that idea for a moment because I think we underestimate it. Being seen, being observed, categorised, judged, evaluated was not an occasional hazard of public life for a Victorian woman. It was the constant baseline condition of her existence. From the moment she left her bedroom in the morning, she was performing respectable femininity, performing appropriate emotion, performing the correct social relationships with the correct people at the correct times. Her clothing announced her class. Her gait announced her virtue. The speed at which she walked, as etiquette books solemnly warned, could invite criticism. A lady ought to adopt a modest and measured gait, one guide instructed. Too much hurry injured the grace which ought to characterize her. She was not to turn her head too often. She was not to look directly at strangers. She was not to be seen in certain streets at certain hours. She was not to be anywhere after twilight without a male escort or a servant accompanying her, because, and this is stated plainly in the etiquette literature, a young lady would not be conducting herself in a becoming manner by walking alone unescorted after dark. So, daytime belonged to the rules. Daytime was a performance on a lit stage, but then the light changed. Something happened in Victorian cities at dusk that I find genuinely fascinating as a social phenomenon. It was not quite day and not quite night. It was not yet the dangerous, morally ambiguous darkness that the etiquette books warned about. And it was no longer the fully public, fully observed arena of the daylight hours. It was something in between, a threshold state. And threshold states throughout human history have always been the moments when the normal rules become temporarily negotiable. Think of it this way. In daylight, everyone knew what a woman was, where she should be, what she should be doing, who she was supposed to be with. In full darkness, a respectable woman simply should not be out at all. But in the twilight hour, in that amber-lit, shadow-broken liminal stretch between the two, there was a kind of ambiguity, a softness in the social enforcement, a gap in the surveillance, and Victorian women who'd become extraordinarily skilled at navigating the small gaps in a system that offered almost no large ones found that gap and used it. There is a piece of social geography that historians of Victorian London have noted, and that I think about often. The parks, London's great parks, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Kensington Gardens. Victoria Park in the east were formal, heavily coded spaces during the daytime hours. The fashionable promenade in Hyde Park, known as Rotten Row, was essentially a social performance space. You were seen there, you were assessed there. Who you walked with, who acknowledged you, who passed you without acknowledgement, all of it was noted, interpreted, discussed. Being seen in the park at the right hour with the right people was social currency. Being seen there with the wrong people, or behaving in a manner that invited comment, was social damage. These were real material stakes in a world where a woman's social reputation was one of the few assets entirely her own to manage. But as the afternoon light softened toward evening, something shifted in how these spaces functioned. The formal promenade hour ended. The most vigilant social observers began drifting toward dinner, and the parks, those same parks that had been social theatre all afternoon, became something quieter, something closer to genuinely public in the best sense of the word. Spaces where a woman could simply walk, not perform, not calculate, just move. Here is a small piece of evidence that I love. In 1883, a woman named Eleanor Vere Boyle, a writer and artist of some note, kept a detailed diary of her life in London through the seasons. In autumn, she records going out almost every evening alone or with one close friend, specifically in the hour before full dark. She describes it as the only hour she writes in which the city felt like it belonged to itself rather than to its rules. She notes the specific quality of the light, what she calls a softening that made familiar streets look as though they were from another city or another time. And she records almost as an aside that she spoke to people on these walks whom she would not have spoken to in daylight. A fishmonger closing his stall, a nursemaid pushing a pram in the last of the light, a woman she recognised from church who was in daytime bound by the same formal protocols of calling cards and approved visiting hours. In the twilight, Eleanor writes, they simply stood and talked, because she concludes the evening made it acceptable somehow. I find that remarkable, that a time of day could functionally change what was socially permissible. But that is precisely what the twilight hour did. Now, I want to be honest about something here because I think the history deserves honesty. The freedom the twilight hour offered was not equal. A married woman in her mid-30s, well established with a settled household reputation, had significantly more latitude in her evening walk than an unmarried girl of 18. A woman who was older past the rigid scrutiny of the marriage market years could move through the evening streets with a kind of quiet authority that younger women simply did not have. And a woman who had already been in society for several seasons, as the etiquette books put it, was gradually released from the most constraining requirements of chaperonage. The social surveillance was not uniform. It was targeted most intensely at women who were considered most at risk of making choices that might embarrass their families, which is to say, young unmarried women. Which is, if you think about it, a fairly elegant description of how social control generally works. The people with the least power get the most watching, but for women who had navigated past the most intense period of that watching, who had married or aged out of it, or established themselves in other ways, the evening walk was genuinely theirs in a way that very little else was. Let me tell you about something I came across while researching this section. Sometime in the mid-1880s, a French writer named Joris Karl Huysmans visited London, and he wrote about the city at dusk, this rainy, vast, soot-coloured city, in terms that struck me as unexpectedly beautiful. He wrote about the way the fog and the gaslight interacted in the evening hours, the chromatic strangeness of it. Because London's famous fog was not grey, Or rather, it was not only grey. Victorian atmospheric chemists later discovered that the tar compounds from coal combustion coloured the fog differently at different times of day. In the early morning, the fog had a yellowish tinge from low-temperature coal burning. Later in the day, as industrial emissions thickened, it darkened toward brown, and in the evening, when the million gas lamps scattered their amber light through the layers of particulate fog, the streets took on a quality of illumination that artists and writers struggle to describe accurately. Claude Monet came to London specifically to paint it. He stood at his window at the Savoy Hotel in 1899 and painted the fog over the Thames at dusk so many times that he eventually produced nearly 100 canvases from those sessions. What transfixed him was not the darkness, it was the light, that dense, luminous, strangely golden quality of a Victorian evening, where the gaslight caught in the fog and turned the whole city into something that looked like a painting of itself. Women who walked in that light were walking through something visually extraordinary, something that does not exist in quite the same way anywhere in the world today. And I think that matters. I think the beauty of those streets at that hour was part of what drew women out into them. Not just the social freedom, not just the medical need for fresh air, but the sheer loveliness of it. Have you ever taken a walk that you did not want to end? Not because the destination was significant, not because anything particular was happening, but because the world was doing something with light and air and sound that felt precious. That sense of not wanting to return indoors, I think that is one of the most universal human experiences there is, and I think Victorian women felt it acutely, because they spent so much time indoors, because the contrast between the enclosed, heated, socially managed interior of a Victorian house and the open, amber-lit, fog-softened street outside was profound in a way we can barely imagine. We have so many ways out. We have parks designed for casual recreation. We have the autonomy to go outside whenever we choose for whatever reason, without requiring an escort or a medical justification or a socially acceptable pretext. Victorian women had the evening constitutional, and they used it for everything that word could hold. Here is something that strikes me as almost poignant when I sit with it. The very fact that the etiquette books were still insisting in the 1880s that a woman should not be out after twilight without an escort suggests something important. It suggests that women were in fact going out after twilight without escorts. You do not write rules forbidding behaviour that is not occurring. You write rules forbidding behaviour that enough people are engaging in that it has become visible. The twilight walk, unchaperoned or minimally chaperoned, was apparently happening frequently enough that it needed to be officially discouraged, which means that the gap was real. The loophole was real, and women were finding it every day. As the amber light came up on the gas lamps and the daytime city began releasing its grip on the day, but here is what strikes me as the most quietly radical thing about all of it. Not the defiance of rules exactly, not the political statement, not even the physical freedom of movement. The most radical thing is what the women were doing with the time once they had it. They were being alone with their thoughts. In an era when women were almost never structurally alone with their thoughts, when every waking hour was oriented towards someone else's needs, someone else's schedule, someone else's comfort, the evening walk offered something close to solitude. Not perfect solitude, not silence, but the kind of moving solitude that walking uniquely provides, where the body is occupied but the mind is free, where you can think without being asked what you're thinking, where you can feel what you feel without having to immediately translate it into appropriate social behaviour. And this, I want to suggest, is where the really interesting things were happening. Not in the parlours, not in the letters, not even in the diaries, but in the unrecorded, unobserved interior of a Victorian woman's mind during those 45 minutes of amber light and moving air. The thoughts that came to her as she walked, the things she worked out, the grief she processed, the anger she let herself acknowledge, the plans she quietly made. That is where we're going next. Because the companions these women walked with, or pointedly did not walk with, tell their own remarkable story. The art of appearing to be accompanied while being in every way that mattered entirely alone, the careful choreography of the chaperone, and the particular, almost subversive genius of what Victorian women call disappearing in plain sight. It is one of the more quietly brilliant social inventions I've come across in all of this, and it begins with a question that sounds simple, but is not. Who exactly counted as being escorted? Who exactly counted as being escorted? That is the question I left you with, and it sounds deceptively simple. But when you start pulling at that thread, what unravels is something far more interesting than a technical answer. What unravels is a whole sociology of strategic companionship, a quietly brilliant social invention that Victorian women developed, refined, and passed between each other over decades, not in any organised way, not in any published form, but in the entirely human way that people share useful information when they need it. Over tea, in letters, in the sideways remarks of diaries written for themselves and perhaps a few trusted readers. The art of appearing to be accompanied while being in every sense that actually mattered entirely alone with your own thoughts. Let me set the scene properly because context matters here. A chaperone in the formal technical etiquette book sense of the word was supposed to be a married woman or a widow of established reputation who physically accompanied a younger unmarried woman into social situations where she might otherwise be at risk of some undefined but apparently catastrophic moral compromise. The rules were strict in the cities. The etiquette literature was extremely clear on this point. Young ladies should never go about the streets of a large town unaccompanied by an older person or a maid. A maid counted. A groom counted in some circumstances. A female relative, even one younger than herself, counted if she happened to be married. This is the detail that I find simultaneously hilarious and illuminating about the whole system. A married woman younger than you was a perfectly acceptable chaperone for you because marriage, not age, was the thing that conferred the moral authority to supervise another woman, which suggests that what the chaperone system was actually protecting was not women at all. It was protecting the institution of marriage, and a Victorian woman who paid close attention to how the system actually functioned, rather than how it theoretically functioned, began to notice something. The rules had more flexibility than they appear to have. Here is a small, precise observation from the Victorian diary archive that I keep coming back to. A researcher at Cambridge University named Mia Adler-Rader, reviewing women's diaries from the mid to late 19th century, noticed a consistent pattern in how solitary walks were recorded. Diarists who walked alone rarely drew attention to the aloneness as anything remarkable. Lady Elizabeth Ingleby, the same diarist we encountered briefly in our very first section, notes on multiple occasions, "Simply I walked alone and enjoyed it much." No anxiety, no justification, no hedging. Just a fact about her day recorded in the same matter-of-fact tone she used to note the weather or what she had eaten for dinner. And Nellie Wheaton, a governess and independent woman of modest means who walked extensively in the early 19th century, kept a meticulous record of her walks with a pride that practically leaps off the page. Looking back over a month of particularly intensive walking, she wrote, "I am astonished at my own strength. Not I hope no one noticed I was alone, not I obtained appropriate permission. Simply, I am astonished at my own strength." That sentence has stayed with me, because it suggests something important. For many Victorian women, certainly not all, and certainly not in all circumstances, the freedom to walk was not experienced as a transgression at all. It was simply a fact of their lives. Something they did quietly, regularly, and without feeling the need to make it into a political statement. But here is where the companionship question gets genuinely interesting. Because for the women who did need or choose to navigate the chaperone requirements for the younger women, the unmarried women, the women in fashionable parts of cities, where social surveillance was at its most intense, they developed something that I think of as the art of creative accompaniment. And it worked, broadly speaking, like this. You needed a companion. Not necessarily for moral protection, not necessarily because you wanted company, but because the presence of another person, almost any other person, satisfied the visible requirement while leaving the internal reality of your walk entirely unchanged. Two women walking together and talking quietly about things that interested neither of them, or about things that interested both of them very much, or walking in comfortable silence, each occupied entirely by her own thoughts. Two women walking together looked from the outside identical. The chaperone system was designed to prevent women from being alone with men. It was not in its practical application designed to prevent women from being alone with their thoughts, and that distinction turned out to matter enormously. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating social formations of the Victorian era. Female friendship. Not friendship in the casual modern sense of the word, but the intense, committed, sometimes physically demonstrative, often lifelong partnerships that Victorian women built with each other, and that the Victorian world, for reasons that become obvious when you think about it, was perfectly comfortable allowing. Because the Victorians believed that women, by their refined and delicate nature, were not capable of sexual feeling. Or rather, they believed it of the kind of women they were paying attention to. And this belief, absurd as it was, had a practical consequence that those women used to their considerable advantage. Two women could share a bed. Two women could hold hands in public. Two women could write each other letters of passionate devotion. Two women could walk together every single evening for 30 years. And the world would look at all of this and nod approvingly at the beauty of female friendship. Because what else would it be? Historians have a term for one particular version of this arrangement. A Boston marriage, borrowed from Henry James's 1886 novel about two women who chose to make a life together entirely outside the institution of marriage. And while the term came from America, the phenomenon was thoroughly international. Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields, a writer and the widow of a prominent publisher, maintained what was openly acknowledged as a committed partnership for nearly 3 decades from the 1870s onward. They travelled together. They shared a home. They appeared in public together so constantly that their friends referred to them as a unit, not as individuals. Fields was also a woman of extraordinary social standing. She had hosted virtually every major literary figure of the era in her Boston drawing room, and her partnership with Jewett was not a secret. It was not hidden. It was simply understood to be a profound and devoted female friendship, because that was the available category, and the available category worked perfectly well for everyone involved. What was happening in the interior of that friendship the Victorians did not examine, which was in many ways exactly the point. Now, I want to be clear about something because I think clarity matters here. Not all walking companions were romantic partners. Not all female friendships in the Victorian era were Boston marriages. The vast majority of women who walked together in the evening were simply friends, neighbours, sisters, women from the same church, the same street, the same circle of acquaintances. But what all of them shared, regardless of the nature of their relationship, was this particular gift. When two women walked together, they created a space. Not a physical space exactly. Though there is something to the physical reality of two people walking side by side, the way conversation flows differently when you're moving forward instead of facing each other across a table. Something more interior than that. A space in which the rules of the drawing room and the calling hour and the careful performance of Victorian femininity simply did not quite apply. Because who was watching? And what exactly were they watching for? Two women walking at a modest and appropriate pace in appropriate clothing in an appropriate neighbourhood. There was nothing to see. And in that invisibility a great deal happened. Dorothy Wordsworth, whose name you may know primarily in relation to her brother William, which is itself a kind of Victorian-era injustice that deserves its own story, walked obsessively and documented her walks in journals that are now recognised as some of the most vivid nature writing of the 19th century. She walked alone. She walked with companions. She walked with her brother William, whose poetry she actively shaped and influenced in ways that literary history is only recently beginning to fully acknowledge. And she walked in the evening specifically and deliberately, because the quality of the light was different then. The world was more itself, she seemed to feel, less performed, less arranged for the benefit of observers, more honest. Dorothy Wordsworth's aunt famously criticised her for rambling about the country on foot. Jane Austen's fictional Caroline Bingley was scandalised by Elizabeth Bennet's muddy hem, and described her walking as evidence of, quote, an abominable sort of conceited independence. And Charlotte Bronte, who gave us Jane Eyre, noted how suspiciously a solitary wandering woman was regarded. How doubtful her character must appear, Jane thinks, simply by virtue of being a woman found walking alone on a road. These are not just literary observations, they are precise social documents. They tell us what the stakes were, they tell us what it cost, and they make the quiet persistence of so many Victorian women who simply went out anyway, who simply walked anyway, who recorded their walks in their diaries, with the mild satisfaction of people who have done something good for themselves all the more remarkable. Let me ask you something. Is there someone in your life who you can walk with in genuine silence? Not the awkward silence of people who have run out of things to say, the other kind, the silence of people who are so comfortable with each other that the absence of words is simply a different kind of conversation. That kind of walking partner is genuinely rare, and I think the Victorians, who had so few spaces in which to be genuinely themselves, understood this rarity with a depth that we perhaps do not. Because the evening walk with a close female companion was not just physical exercise. It was for many Victorian women the only time in their entire day when they could speak freely, when they could say things they had been thinking all day without worrying about who was listening, when they could confess to ambitions or frustrations or observations that would have been in the drawing room or at the dinner table entirely inappropriate. The walk was in a very real sense where Victorian women's true conversations happened, not the conversations they recorded, not the conversations anyone else heard, the ones that passed between two women at dusk walking at a modest and appropriate pace in the amber gaslight between the pools of shadow. There is something I've been thinking about since the beginning of this story, something about the nature of quiet resistance. The Victorians were very focused on grand gestures, on public demonstrations, on things that could be seen and evaluated and judged. But the most durable forms of resistance are usually the ones that do not announce themselves, the ones that simply continue, that occur day after day in the spaces between the visible events. The evening walk was never going to appear in any history of women's liberation. It was not a march, it was not a petition, it was not a published argument or a political speech. It was a woman putting on her coat, stepping outside, taking a breath of air that was not filtered through the walls of a room designed to contain her, and then often turning to a friend, a real friend, the kind you do not perform for, and walking, for 40 minutes, for an hour, sometimes more if no one was going to come looking, just the two of them, or just herself. Moving through a world that was for those brief particular minutes genuinely her own. What I want to suggest, and this is my own reading, my own sense of what the history is pointing at, is that the solitude these women found on their evening walks was not absence. It was presence. presence with themselves, with their own minds, with the specific quality of their own experience on a specific evening in a specific city in a specific decade. And that form of presence for many Victorian women was genuinely revolutionary, not because anyone revolutionary was planning it, but because a mind given space to be itself does not stay small. It goes places, it makes connections, it asks questions, it begins to notice things, and what Victorian women noticed in that amber light with their companions, or without them, the things they began to see when they had enough room to look, those observations are what we turn to next. Because the evening walk was not just the first breath of freedom, it was for some extraordinary women the first breath of something they had not even known they were reaching for. The world outside the window, the world that smelled of coal smoke and damp stone and cooling bread from the baker's shop on the corner. A world that arrived in the twilight hour through every sense at once. And what that sensory world gave them, what it awakened, what it shifted, what it quietly changed, is one of the most unexpectedly beautiful chapters in this entire story. We are almost there. Close your eyes for a moment. Just for a moment. Picture yourself standing outside a front door in London in the autumn of 1884. Not a grand door, a respectable middle-class door on a respectable middle-class street, somewhere between the fashionable West and the working East. It is perhaps 5:30 in the evening. The last week daylight is draining out of the sky to the southwest, leaving something between grey and amber behind it. You take a step forward, and the world arrives. Not gently, not gradually, all at once. That is the thing about Victorian London that no photograph, no painting, no period drama has ever quite managed to capture. The smell. Let us be honest about this, because I think we have a tendency to romanticize the Victorian street into something it absolutely was not. By the 1880s, London was home to somewhere between 4 and 5 million people. It was also home to approximately 300,000 horses. 300,000 horses producing between them roughly 1,000 tons of manure every single day on London streets. Lee Jackson, the author of A History of Victorian Sanitation, described the scale of it as an immense and almost impossible challenge. And that was just the horses. There was also the coal. By 1880, London was burning 10 million tons of coal per year. 10 million tons, generating a sulphurous, sooty fog that settled on everything on your coat, your hair, the exposed skin of your hands and face. A contemporary observer noted that sheep brought to graze in Regent's Park turned black within days, their wool darkened by the soot in the air. Shopkeepers complained that the ammonia rising from the streets was discolouring the facades of their buildings. And then there was the Thames, which before Joseph Bazalgette's heroic sewer system finally came properly online, in the 1870s had been, in the words of one historian, not much more than an enormous open sewer flowing through the centre of the most powerful city on earth. So, this is the world Victorian women were walking into when they stepped out for their evening constitutional. And here is the genuinely surprising thing. They loved it, not despite the smell and the sound and the press of the city, because of it. I want to try to explain that because I think it requires some explanation. We are accustomed in the modern world to a kind of sensory neutrality. We design our environments to be as inoffensive to the senses as possible. Temperature controlled, sound dampened, smell filtered, clean, regular, consistent. Victorian domestic interiors, even comfortable middle-class Victorian domestic interiors, were not sensory neutral spaces. They were intensely specific in their own way. Coal fires, which were the only source of heat, produced a particular smoky warmth that settled into every fabric in the room. Gas lamps burning inside created a slightly sulphurous undertone beneath the smell of whatever was cooking. The Victorian household had its own dense, layered, particular smell of beeswax and coal smoke, and cooked meat, and the lavender or rose sachets used to scent wardrobes, and it was a smell that defined the interior of a life spent largely indoors. And then, you stepped outside and everything changed. The Victorian street at dusk was a complete sensory universe, and I mean that almost literally. Start with the sound, because the sound is what hits you first. By the 1880s, the dominant auditory experience of a London street was the horse. Not cars, not motorcycles, not the white noise of modern urban traffic. The specific rhythmic, deeply physical sound of iron-shod hooves on cobblestone. A contemporary observer once recorded the sounds of a typical London side street as the everlasting sound of men, women, children, omnibuses, carriages, street coaches, wagons, carts, dog carts, steeple bells and doorbells. Street sellers called their wares from first light until well into the evening. The sweeps in the morning, the dustmen with their bells, the milkmaids with their heavy wooden yokes. By evening, the character of the street sound shifted. The market sellers were quieting. The delivery boys with their potboys' roots carrying foaming cans of supper beer to households along set paths were making their last rounds. The carriages returning from afternoon visits were clattering through the residential streets. And occasionally rising above all of it there was music. The street musicians of Victorian London were a particular obsession of the era. Organ grinders, Italian-born for the most part, operating the barrel organs that played automatically as they turned. The handle were so numerous and so controversial that the philosopher Thomas Carlyle, who famously desired silence above all things, mounted a personal campaign against them. He wrote about his suffering in terms so extravagant that they have become a kind of accidental comedy. He built a soundproof study. He lobbied for legal action. He wrote anguished letters to newspapers. The organ grinders kept grinding, and I think about the Victorian women who would have passed those organ grinders on their evening walks. The sudden burst of melody in the middle of a grey street. The particular way music operates on the body when you encounter it unexpectedly, the involuntary lift in the chest, the way your pace changes slightly without you deciding to change it. That music was not background, it was event. Now let me tell you about the smell of bread. I keep coming back to this because it appears so consistently in accounts of Victorian street life that it must have been genuinely prominent. The bakers worked through the night and into the early morning, which meant that in the late afternoon and evening the ovens were cooling. The day's bread had been sold, and what the air carried instead was the warm, fading ghost of it, the specific, irreplaceable smell of bread that has just finished baking, which is, as any poll of favourite smells will consistently confirm, among the most universally beloved scents in human experience. 30% of people in modern surveys rank fresh bread as among their favourite smells, more popular than sizzling bacon, more popular than fresh flowers, and on an autumn evening in Victorian London that smell would have been filtering out of bakery doors along the entire route of a woman's walk, combined with the coal smoke, combined with the damp stone of the street after rain, combined with the horse and the fog, and the particular amber-tinged air we discussed in the last section. The Victorian evening street was in all its complexity and contradiction, and genuine occasional unpleasantness, an overwhelmingly vivid sensory experience, and it arrived as a gift every evening to women who had spent the day inside. Here is something I find genuinely moving about the diary record. When Victorian women wrote about their evening walks, they almost never wrote about what they were thinking. They wrote about what they were noticing, the specific tree in the park that had turned first, the particular quality of the light on a given evening, the sound of a church bell carried on the wind from further away than usual, a cat on a doorstep, a child running, The way the fog had gathered at the end of the street, turning the gas lamp at the corner into something soft and diffuse and slightly mysterious. These are not the observations of people performing their experience for an audience. These are the observations of people who have been given for a brief daily interval the gift of simply noticing. The scholar Mia Adler-Rueda, working through the Cambridge Victorian Literature Archive, identified this as one of the most consistent features of women's walking diaries, what she calls a paradigm of everyday adventure. The walking woman is not transgressing. She's not making a political statement. She's simply moving through a world that offers at every moment the opportunity for small, unexpected, unrepeatable encounters. A voyage of discovery one diarist called her daily walk, not metaphorically, quite literally. Even a street walked 100 times before could offer something new on any given evening. And that sense of potential, the sense that something might happen, something might be noticed, something might shift, was itself part of the gift. Let me tell you about the touch of it. Because touch is the most intimate of the senses, the most immediate, the most impossible to hold at arm's length. And the Victorian woman stepping outside was immediately inescapably touched by the world. The temperature of the air on her face, the specific texture of the wind which in an autumn evening in London would carry the cold from the river, along with the coal smoke and the fog, the resistance of cobblestone under the sole of a walking boot entirely different from the resistance of a carpeted floor, the slight adjustment required when the pavement changed from smooth to uneven, the subtle recalibration of balance and attention, even the weight of her own skirts moving against her legs with each step was different outdoors, less constrained, more expressive of her actual movement than in the carefully arranged sitting rooms designed to keep fabric and furniture in their proper relationship. The body outdoors was doing something it has been designed to do, moving through space, adjusting continuously to a world that was not controlled, and there is something in that, something physiological, something that happens in the relationship between body and brain, when the environment is genuinely variable and genuinely requiring of attention, that produces a particular quality of mental clarity. We know this now from neuroscience. We know that walking in varied outdoor environments activates the brain differently than sitting still, that the rhythm of walking has measurable effects on mood and cognition, that exposure to natural sounds, even the impure, complicated natural and urban sounds of a Victorian street, produces measurable reductions in physiological stress indicators. The Victorian women did not know any of this in those terms, but their bodies knew it. And their diaries recording the sensory details of their walks with such consistent precision and apparent pleasure suggest they knew it in the way that really matters, experientially, physically, in the body before it could be put into words. Think about the last time you were truly present in a physical environment, not looking at it through a phone screen, not planning what you were going to do when you got home, not composing a message in your head while nominally walking somewhere, actually present, noticing, attending. If you have been in nature recently, on a beach, in a forest, in a garden at the right hour, you might know what I'm talking about. That feeling of the mind going quiet in a particular way, not empty, quiet, attentive, receptive. The Victorians called the faculty we are describing here observation. They prized it enormously as an intellectual virtue. Charles Dickens, who walked 10 to 20 miles through London streets at night when he needed to think, called walking his great resort and his necessary drug. He said he could not write if he did not walk, that the streets fed him something his study could not, and what was true for Dickens was true in their own different forms and circumstances and contexts for the women who walk the same streets. There is a small piece of the sensory experience I want to mention specifically because I think it is often overlooked. Touch, smell, sound, these are the obvious ones. But there is also the matter of the sky. Inside a Victorian house, the sky was what you glimpsed through a window, framed, bounded, reduced to a rectangle of whatever the weather was doing, filtered through glass mediated by curtains and the perspective of a room. But outside in the evening, the sky was simply itself, and the Victorian evening sky over London was genuinely extraordinary in ways that even the coal smoke could not entirely obscure. We talked about the fog and the gaslight in the last section, but in the late evening when the fog thinned slightly, and the last of the daylight was doing something complicated with the particulate air, the colours produced were unlike anything we see in cities today. Artists travelled to London specifically to paint them. The writer John Ruskin, who was one of the finest observers of visual phenomena in the 19th century, wrote extensively about the specific quality of English sky, its changeability, its particular grey and gold palette, the way clouds move differently here than anywhere else. And for a woman who had spent the entire day in gaslit interiors, the sudden unmediated expanse of that sky, even a winter sky, even a fog-thickened sky, even a sky that was doing nothing in particular, was a form of relief so physical it could produce something close to vertigo. The sheer scale of it. The simple reminder that the world was larger than any room. I want to be careful here because I do not want to make this sound like a pure pastoral idyll. The Victorian street had genuine difficulties that I mentioned at the beginning, and those difficulties were real and not to be dismissed. The smell was complex. The noise was relentless. The mud and the pollution and the press of bodies in certain parts of the city were genuinely unpleasant in ways that a modern person would find difficult. What I am trying to describe is not a perfect world. I'm trying to describe an alive one. A world where the senses were fully engaged with a reality that was varied and textured and honest about what it was. And the women who walked through it, who noticed the specific angle of the gas lamp's light on the wet cobblestones, who timed their walks to the baker's cooling oven, who paused on a corner to listen to a barrel organ playing something from an opera they had heard once at a concert. Those women were not romanticizing their world. They were inhabiting it. Fully, presently, with all of themselves. And that inhabitation of the present moment, the complete sensory bodily engagement with the world as it actually was, is I think what the evening walk was ultimately giving them. Not escape from their lives, entry into them, a different, truer, more embodied entry than anything the drawing room could offer. Something about this makes me think of a phrase I once read in a Victorian woman's diary, not one of the famous ones, not anyone whose name is remembered, just a woman who walked every evening and wrote about it afterwards. She described a particular autumn evening in these terms, and I am paraphrasing rather than quoting because the language is her own and should stay hers. She said that she had gone out feeling heavy her word and come home feeling opened. Not lighter exactly, opened. As though the walk had done something to her interior dimensions, made more room. I have never read a better description of what regular walking in the open air actually does. She was not describing a medical benefit. She was not describing exercise or fresh air in the language of the Constitution. She was describing something more personal than that. The way the outside world absorbed through the body rearranges the furniture of the mind, makes space where there was no space, opens doors that the interior world has quietly closed, and those doors once opened led somewhere. Because the Victorian woman who came home from her evening walk was not quite the same woman who had left. She had noticing that nobody else knew about. She had thought that nobody had witnessed. She'd felt the cold and the warmth and the coal smoke and the music and the particular quality of amber light on wet stone. And sometimes not always, not reliably, not by prescription. All of that sensory accumulation, all of that present moment attention, produced something else entirely. Something inside the mind that began to move, that began to ask questions, that began to reach for the thing it needed to say. The relationship between walking and thinking is one of the oldest and most powerful in human creative history, and Victorian women who had so few other forms of mental freedom available to them discovered it in the evening hours with an intensity that left unmistakable marks in everything they wrote. The poets among them, the novelists, the reformers, the women who did not write at all but whose inner lives were shaped by it nonetheless. We're going to talk about those women next, about what the walking cured, not what doctors prescribed, not what etiquette manuals approved, but what the body discovered on its own in the quiet accumulation of all those evening miles, the slow, extraordinary medicine of movement. There is something almost comedic about the history of Victorian medicine and women's bodies, not funny in the way that makes you laugh easily, funny in the way that makes you go quiet for a moment first. Because the story of how Victorian doctors finally admitted slowly, reluctantly, in carefully worded paragraphs published in serious journals that walking was good for women is really a story about how long it can take for the obvious to become acceptable. And I think that story's worth telling carefully. Let me take you back to a specific moment in the 1870s. Not to a hospital, not to a laboratory, to a garden. The garden belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. You may know her name. She was the first woman in Britain to qualify as a physician and surgeon, having fought her way through an almost incomprehensibly hostile medical establishment to obtain her license through the Society of Apothecaries in 1865 because every other institution had refused to examine her. What is less often discussed is what she wrote about the relationship between physical activity, outdoor life, and women's health in the years following her qualification. Anderson was not a romantic about nature. She was a scientist. She did not describe walking as pleasurable or emotionally restorative in the way we might today. She described it in clinical terms as a necessary intervention for bodies that were being systematically damaged by the conditions of women's indoor lives, the pallor, the fatigue, the chronic headaches, the digestive problems, the nervous complaints that filled her consultation rooms. Anderson repeatedly traced these not to inherent female biological weakness, but to specific, identifiable, correctable circumstances: insufficient movement, insufficient fresh air, insufficient exposure to daylight. She was saying in the careful language of medicine that the very life women were required to lead was the thing making them ill, and the cure which she consistently recommended was so simple, so cheap, so completely accessible that it was almost insulting. Go outside, walk, now. The medical establishment of the 1870s did not receive this argument well, and this is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because I want to resist the temptation to draw the history too neatly. The truth is that by the time Anderson was practicing, there was already a growing faction within Victorian medicine that recognized the value of exercise for women. The disagreement was not simply between progressives and conservatives. It was more nuanced and more interesting than that. The core tension, and this is the thing I find genuinely fascinating, was not about whether women should exercise. It was about what kind of exercise, for what purpose, in what quantities, under what conditions, and crucially, who should be allowed to decide. As early as 1812, a physician writing on women's health had stated that walking was the best exercise for men and women alike, and should be practiced every single day of the year, unless the weather absolutely forbade. He observed with some envy that English women, specifically upper-class and delicate English women, walked several miles almost daily and were none the worse for it. He contrasted this favourably with what he described as the American tendency to consider it a mark of feminine delicacy to remain indoors, and he was quite pointed about the consequences: a slender constitution, he wrote, a pallid cheek, the early decay of teeth, and the premature loss of all the beauty that health can bestow. now that Physician was writing in the early part of the century before the full machinery of Victorian gender ideology was in place. By the 1860s and 70s, the medical conversation had become considerably more fraught. On one side, you had the school of thought we explored in Part 3, the neurasthenia theorists, the men who believed female nervous systems were inherently fragile, and that intellectual and physical exertion drained reproductive energy. On the other side, you had a growing body of clinical evidence that simply did not support this. The women who walked were not in measurable fact more likely to collapse. They were less likely to. The Vitalogy, a popular American medical reference book widely circulated in the late Victorian period, put it with a directness that feels almost modern. It stated that each person requires a substantial volume of fresh air per hour to breathe, and that free time should be spent outdoors soaking up what sunlight and clean air were available. Many health authorities of the period were recommending regular outdoor exercise as a matter of course. But here is the catch that I think is crucial. Most of those authorities were still framing the recommendation within the language of female limitation. They recommended moderate exercise, gentle walking, nothing too strenuous, nothing that might overexcite the nervous system. Nothing that might, and this phrase appears repeatedly in medical literature of the era, produce unladylike fatigue and sunburning. The exercise was permitted, but it was permitted in a cage, a very pleasant, health-promoting, medically sanctioned cage. And the bars of that cage were made of the same assumptions that had built all the other cages we have been talking about, which is why what happened in the 1880s is so interesting. Because the 1880s is when the cage started to show visible cracks, not because of a single revolutionary discovery, not because of one brilliant doctor writing one transformative paper, but because of something more gradual, more cumulative, and ultimately more powerful. Women started walking more, a lot more, and they were obviously undeniably visibly better for it. The evidence was everywhere. In the diaries we've been exploring throughout this video, the same pattern appears with striking consistency across women of different backgrounds, different temperaments, different circumstances. Women who walked regularly described sleeping better, eating better, thinking more clearly, feeling what one diarist called a returning of herself to herself after a period of illness or low spirits. Now, we need to be careful here because the Victorians did not have the vocabulary or the tools to describe what was actually happening physiologically when these women walked. What they were experiencing and what we can describe with some confidence now was a complex interaction of effects. Dr. J. William White, a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote in Lippincott's magazine in 1887, and I want to quote this carefully, because the language is extraordinary for its time, that exercise was by far the most important therapeutic and hygienic agency at the command of the physician of that day, and that it could be prescribed on as rational a basis, with as distinct reference to the correction of existing troubles or the prevention of threatened ones as any drug in the pharmacopoeia. Let me sit with that for a moment. In 1887, a physician was saying in print in a mainstream American publication that exercise was comparable to medicine, not a supplement to medicine, not a pleasant adjunct to real treatment, as effective as any drug. This was not a fringe opinion from an eccentric. White was a faculty member at a major university. He was saying what clinical observation had been quietly accumulating for years. And while he was writing in the American context, the same conversation was happening in British medical journals simultaneously. The Lancet, which was then as now the most prestigious medical journal in the English-speaking world, ran an increasingly contested series of discussions throughout the 1870s and 1880s about women's bodies, women's health, and what medicine actually owed female patients. The debate was, in the words of one historian who studied it, characterized by fluctuations and inconsistencies, which is academic language for the fact that even within a single journal, the position was not unified, was actively contested and was changing. What drove it to change was the thing that always eventually drives medicine to change: clinical reality. Doctors who actually treated women who sat with them in consulting rooms, who monitored their health over years, who observed what happened when patients followed different recommendations, began to accumulate observations that the theory of female nervous fragility simply could not account for. The women who walked did not deteriorate. The women who stayed in bed often did. You can only ignore clinical observation for so long before it starts to embarrass you. There is a particular piece of this history that I want to spend a moment on because I think it is both deeply ironic and genuinely important. Tuberculosis. Consumption, as it was called. It was the leading cause of death in Britain across the Victorian period, responsible for roughly 1/6 of all deaths in 1838, and still a devastating presence in the 1870s and 80s, and it disproportionately affected women, not by chance, by circumstance. Women were kept indoors. Poor ventilation, inadequate sunlight, confined spaces, these were the conditions in which tuberculosis thrived. The very life Victorian medicine prescribed for the delicate female constitution was in measurable biological terms the life most likely to make women susceptible to the most lethal disease of the era, and what was one of the consistent observations made by physicians watching patients with early-stage tuberculosis: that women who managed to spend time outdoors, who walked regularly, who got daylight and fresh air, progressed more slowly, were more resilient, sometimes recovered when their circumstances allowed them access to what we would now call basic preventive medicine. The air that was allegedly too much for the female nervous system was in the most literal biological terms keeping women alive. I find myself returning to a question that I think cuts to the heart of this particular chapter of history. Have you ever been told that something was too much for you, and quietly discovered on your own that it wasn't, that the limitation existed in someone else's head before it existed anywhere near your actual capacity? Because I think that is precisely what was happening to Victorian women in the 1870s and 1880s, not metaphorically, not as a feminist reading imposed on the past, literally. They were being told by educated men with medical degrees and published papers that their bodies could not tolerate what their bodies were in the privacy of their own experience clearly tolerating. And the remarkable thing, the thing that keeps drawing me back to this period, is not that the medical establishment was wrong. Established thinking has always been wrong about things in every era. The remarkable thing is how the correction happened. Not through a dramatic revolution, not through a moment of sudden enlightenment, through the quiet, accumulating, undeniable weight of women simply doing the thing they were not supposed to be able to do, walking every evening, going outside, coming home, doing it again the next day, their bodies constituting between them an enormous clinical trial that no physician had designed or authorized. The walking cure, and I use that phrase deliberately because it was used at the time, became something that straddled a very interesting boundary. On the medical side, it was being endorsed in cautious and carefully qualified language by a growing number of practitioners. On the social side, it was still for much of the period technically beyond the bounds of what respectable women were supposed to do without permission, which created a situation of genuine historical comedy that I want to describe properly. By the 1880s, you could have a Victorian woman whose doctor had recommended she walk for her health. Her husband had, in principle, approved the constitutional. The Rational Dress Society had produced walking dresses to make the enterprise more physically manageable. The etiquette books had stopped quite so explicitly forbidding it, and yet, and this is the part I love, nobody quite knew what to do with a woman who was walking alone briskly with obvious purpose and evident enjoyment at 5:30 in the evening on a public street. She was not transgressing anymore, she was following medical advice. but something about her presence in that space still made people uncomfortable in a way they could not entirely articulate. Because the walking was not just walking. It had never been just walking. It was a statement about space and time and the right to inhabit a body in public without apology. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the American-born physician who became the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States in 1849, and who later practiced in London, wrote with characteristic directness about the absurdity of the medical case against women's exercise. She argued that the symptoms being attributed to female biological weakness were in most cases straightforwardly explainable by the conditions of women's lives. Insufficient exercise, insufficient fresh air, insufficient intellectual engagement. The cure was not specialized treatment. The cure was a different life. Blackwell understood something that many of her male colleagues did not or chose not to, which was that prescribing a walk for a woman was not a medical intervention in the narrow sense. It was a social intervention. It was medicine telling society that the way women were being kept was itself the disease. What changed between the beginning and the end of the Victorian era on this question was not simply medical opinion. What changed was the accumulation of evidence that could no longer be explained away. Women who exercised were not fragile. Women who exercised did not sacrifice their reproductive capacity. Women who exercised were in the observable clinical experience of physicians who treated them over decades simply better, more resilient, more cognitively engaged, less prone to the entire catalogue of nervous complaints that had been filling Victorian consultation rooms for generations. By 1900, the idea that walking was beneficial for women had become so thoroughly established that it barely needed stating. The debate had been settled, but settled in a strange way, because the women themselves had never really been part of the argument. They had simply been doing it, every evening, in the dusk, while the medical establishment caught up. I want to close this section with something that I have been sitting with since I first encountered it in the archival research. A physician writing in the late Victorian period described with some evident surprise the physical transformation he had observed in patients who began regular walking programs. He noted their improved colour, their better sleep, their reduced complaints of headache and nervous exhaustion. He attributed this to the physiological effects of exercise on circulation and respiratory function, all of which is correct. But he mentioned almost as an aside one thing that he could not quite explain within his existing framework. The women who walked seemed less anxious, not just physically better. Something more interior had changed. He described it cautiously as a generalized improvement in nervous tone. He did not have a better explanation. The neuroscience that would eventually explain what he was seeing, the relationship between rhythmic physical movement, the autonomic nervous system, the regulation of cortisol and serotonin, the measurable effects of outdoor exposure on circadian rhythm and mood was decades away from being developed. But he noticed it. He could see it in his patients' faces. Something was coming back into them. Some quality he did not have a clinical name for. What he was observing without knowing how to say it was what the women already knew. What the evening walks had been giving them all along. Not just health, themselves. And those selves, now healthier, now more mobile, now increasingly legitimized by the very medical establishment that had once tried to keep them still, were beginning to change. Not just in private ways, not just in the interior lives recorded in diaries that almost no one read, but in larger, more visible, more socially consequential ways. Because the 1880s were not an ending point. They were a beginning. The women who walked through that decade were walking into something that would reshape not just their own lives but the world they were walking through. Britain was about to meet a different kind of woman, one who did not ask permission to take up space, one who moved through the world with a new kind of pace, one who has a name that still carries a kind of electricity even now, the New Woman, and she walked faster than anyone who came before her. Let us step back for a moment from the world we've been inhabiting, because so far in this video the women we've been following through the drawing rooms and the parks, through the etiquette debates and the medical consultations and the diary entries, have been almost without exception women of a certain kind. Middle-class women. Women with enough money to employ at least one servant. Women with enough time in their evenings to walk for pleasure. Women whose problem with Victorian life was not poverty or exhaustion, or the constant grinding arithmetic of survival. Their problem, and it was real, I do not want to minimize it, was restriction. Confinement within a comfortable cage. But there was another Victorian woman, millions of her in fact, and her relationship to the evening, to the street, to walking and to freedom was so different from everything we have discussed so far that it deserves its own chapter entirely. The 1880 census recorded that in England and Wales roughly a third of all women over the age of 10 were in paid employment. But that number, as historians who have studied the period are careful to point out, was almost certainly a significant undercount. It did not capture the women doing piecework at home, finishing garments, stitching shoes, assembling matchboxes, work that was done in kitchens and bedrooms, and was paid per unit rather than per hour, and left no trace in official statistics. It did not adequately capture the women running small market stalls, or taking in washing, or the combinations of irregular work that made up most working-class women's economic lives. The journalist Henry Mayhew, who spent years in the 1850s and 60s documenting the street life and labour of London's poor, catalogued what he found with the diligence of a naturalist. Watercress sellers, flower sellers, fish sellers, women selling from barrows at Spitalfields Market before dawn in order to have their goods ready by the time the neighbourhood woke, and behind all of them the invisible women doing piecework at home who Mayhew estimated numbered in the tens of thousands in London alone, working in conditions of what he called sweated labour, for wages so low that 12 hours of work might earn less than a skilled man earned in one. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. And I want to be careful here because I think there is a temptation in historical storytelling to map the working-class woman's experience either as pure suffering or as a kind of uncomplicated freedom that the middle-class woman lacked. Neither is accurate. The truth is more interesting and in some ways more ironic than either of those versions. In one specific sense, the working-class woman of Victorian England was freer in the street than her social betters, enormously freer. She walked to work, she walked to the market, she walked to the communal water pump, the wash house, the pawn shop on Friday when money was short. She walked because she had no choice. The carriage was not available to her. The theoretical prohibition on unaccompanied women walking in public was not directed at her. It was a rule designed to protect the social value of middle-class femininity, and it had never applied in any meaningful social sense to women who worked with their bodies for money. A mill girl walking to the factory at 5:30 in the morning was not transgressing anything. She was simply getting to work. The historian Judith Walkowitz, whose research on Victorian street life remains among the most detailed and careful, we've described the Victorian city as placing walking women into two rough categories in the public imagination: the vulnerable, respectable, middle-class woman harassed by the dangerous freedoms of the street, and the streetwise working girl whose presence in public space was accepted, but accepted in the way that a piece of furniture is accepted as part of the expected landscape, unremarkable, not requiring particular moral management. What this meant in practical terms was that working-class women walked freely, but their walking was not legible as freedom. It was just what poor women did. Nobody wrote admiring articles about the factory girl's constitutional, Nobody published medical papers praising the mill workers' brisk morning walk as evidence of female physical capacity. The walking was invisible because it was necessity, and necessity in the Victorian calculus of social meaning carried no symbolic weight at all. Here is a specific scene I want you to picture. The year is 1859, Wigan, Lancashire. A factory whistle sounds somewhere in the complex of textile buildings. The machinery slows, stops, and the women come out. They flood down narrow staircases and pour into the street, and the contemporary account that survives describes the sound of it very precisely. Clogs clattering on cobblestones, bare feet on damp paving flags. They linked arms, this account says. They gossiped. This was their own time. This was their dinner hour. At some point during one of these breaks, a well-dressed man was observed standing across the street with a sketchbook. He was an artist named Eyre Crow. He was going to paint them. Exactly as they were, he told them. He made a painting called Dinner Hour Wigan, which hangs in the Manchester Art Gallery. It shows working women in the open air, animated, social, moving freely through public space, standing as they pleased, laughing. One woman in the background stands with her hand on her hip, weight shifted, looking at something outside the frame, with an expression that contains, if you look at it carefully, something that is not quite defiance and not quite ease, but occupies the interesting territory between them. The Manchester Guardian reviewed the painting and complained that the women looked too clean. The cotton dust that coated their hair and clothing in the actual factory had been omitted. The reviewer was not wrong. But looking at Crow's women now, I find myself thinking about something else. In that brief dinner hour, in that small window of time between the whistle that stopped the looms and the whistle that started them again, those women were on the street, fully, bodily, unambiguously present in public space, in a way that required no medical prescription, no etiquette negotiation, no careful timing of twilight. They just stepped outside, because the door was right there. But let me complicate this further, because the story of working-class women and walking is not simply a story of greater freedom. It is also a story of less of almost everything else. When a female mill worker left her shift after 10 hours at the loom, and the 1874 Factory Act had recently limited the working week to 56.5 hours, which workers and reformers alike recognised as progress, because before that it had been worse. She was not walking toward anything that resembled leisure in the middle-class sense. She was walking home to a second shift of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and the additional piecework that many families depended on to make ends meet. A female worker in the 1850s could expect to earn on average 8 shillings for a 60-hour working week. A man doing the same work in the same factory might earn 20 shillings. The arithmetic of that inequality meant that the walking home that followed the factory shift was not a constitutional. It was a transition between two forms of labour, and the walk itself was not the same walk. I want to pause on this because geography matters in this story in a way that is easy to overlook. The middle-class woman's evening walk happened in spaces that had been at least partially designed with her in mind: Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Kensington Gardens, the respectable residential streets of the West End where the pavements were kept reasonably clear, where the gas lamps were relatively reliable, where the risk of genuine physical danger was low enough to be managed by the social conventions we've been discussing. The working-class woman's walk happened in different geography entirely, in the East End of London, in the mill towns of the North, in the back-to-back terraces of Birmingham and Manchester and Leeds, where housing was so dense that between 1801 and 1851, Manchester and Salford's population had grown from 90,000 to 400,000 people, more than 4 times in 50 years, without anything like a proportional increase in the space available to live in or move through or breathe. A campaigner named William Fielden, who represented Blackburn in Parliament in 1833, was asked by a government committee whether there were any spaces in his constituency where children of the working classes could resort for games or exercise. His answer was none whatsoever. None, not restricted, not technically forbidden, simply non-existent. The public park movement, the Victorian effort to create planned green space for urban populations, was in theory a response to exactly this problem. Victoria Park in East London opened in 1845. Birkenhead Park in Merseyside opened in 1847, the park that inspired Frederick Law Olmsted when he designed Central Park in New York. The idea was genuinely held by its proponents was democratic. Public space for public benefit, parks for all classes, air and light and green for the people who needed it most. And to some extent this worked. Working-class families did use the parks. Working-class women walked in them, but the parks were also managed, policed in the informal social sense by the values of the class that had designed and funded them. Behaviours acceptable in a Milltown dinner hour, the linking of arms, the loud conversation, the physical ease of women who were not performing respectability, were coded as inappropriate in the new rational recreation spaces. The park was free to enter, but the experience inside it came with expectations that were not equally distributed. I want to tell you about a specific geography that I find almost unbearably poignant. The rural villages and small market towns of Victorian England. Because when we talk about walking, when we picture the evening constitutional, we tend to picture a city, London perhaps, or one of the great mill towns. But most of Victorian England was not a city. Most of the population well into the 1880s lived in places where the nearest gas lamp might be half a mile away, and for women in those places the relationship to outdoor space was entirely different again. Flora Thompson, who grew up in a small Oxfordshire hamlet in the 1870s and 80s, and later wrote about it in her extraordinary memoir Lark Rise to Candleford, describes the women of her village in terms that make the urban bourgeois anxiety about the evening walk seem almost absurd by comparison. The women of Lark Rise were outside constantly, not for leisure, not for the constitutional, for water which had to be fetched from a communal pump, for fuel which had to be gathered, for the kitchen garden which was part of the household economy, for the children who played in the lane, for the neighbour whose house was 3 doors away and whose kitchen door was always open. These women moved through their physical environment with a casualness, a bodily unself-consciousness that no middle-class etiquette book had ever anticipated, because no middle-class etiquette book had ever thought about them. They were outside, all the time, without permission, without a constitutional, without a medical prescription, without a chaperone, because the concept of the supervised outdoor woman had never been applied to their lives in the first place. Here is the irony that sits at the heart of this whole chapter, and I do not think it is a small one. The evening walker's freedom, the thing we have been celebrating for 7 parts of this video, was a freedom that existed precisely because it was being withheld. You can only feel the liberation of stepping outside if someone has spent considerable energy trying to keep you inside. The middle-class woman who slipped out at twilight for her 45 minutes of unobserved walking was experiencing something genuine and real and valuable, but she was experiencing it as an exception to a rule, as a loophole, as a negotiated space within a larger architecture of restriction. The working-class woman who walked to work before dawn and walked home after dark, who fetched water and carried laundry, and stood in doorways watching the street she moved through the world, with her body as a matter of daily fact. Nobody had written a rule about her movements, because nobody had thought her movements required management, and that paradoxically meant she never experienced the particular quality of liberation that comes from a forbidden thing being briefly permitted. She just walked, because walking was what you did when you needed to get somewhere, and everywhere she needed to be required her feet, Does that make her experience richer or poorer than the middle-class woman's? I genuinely do not know. I think it makes it different in ways that matter. The factory girl who linked arms with her friends outside the Wigan Mill on her dinner hour was not experiencing a transcendent moment of sensory immersion in the Victorian urban landscape. She was resting her feet and eating her bread. She was catching up on whatever the woman in the next row had done the previous evening. She was perhaps laughing at something that had no philosophical significance whatsoever. And there is something in the sheer unself-conscious ordinariness of working women's public presence that I find more honest in its way than the careful middle-class record of what it felt like to be briefly free. What the historical record gives us when we look at it honestly across class lines is not one story about Victorian women and walking. It is at least three. The middle-class woman for whom walking was a negotiated freedom and a subtle form of resistance. The working-class woman for whom walking was simply necessary and whose public presence was so expected as to be invisible, and the rural woman for whom the distinction between inside and outside had never been drawn in the same way at all. These three stories are not in competition. They are not a hierarchy with the middle-class story of liberation at the top and the working-class story of necessity at the bottom. They are different relationships to the same basic human act of moving through the world, and together they tell us something more complete and more honest about Victorian women's lives than any single story can. What they also tell us, and this is where I want to end this section, is that the geography of freedom is never uniform. The right to move through the world on your own terms, in your own time, at your own pace, has always been distributed unevenly, by class, by race, by geography, by the particular configuration of restrictions that your society has decided apply to someone of your specific kind. The Victorian era did not invent this. It just made the architecture of it unusually visible, unusually documented. And in that documentation in the middle-class diaries, and the parliamentary reports and the factory paintings and the census records that undercounted the women doing invisible work, we can trace, if we look carefully enough, the beginnings of a change. Because all three of those women, the middle-class woman at twilight, the factory girl at dinner hour, the village woman at the pump, were moving. All of them were taking up space. All of them were in their very different ways refusing to be still. And in the 1880s, a new kind of woman was beginning to appear. One who took all of that movement, the careful twilight navigation of the middle-class woman, the bold outdoor ease of the working girl, the unself-conscious physicality of the rural woman, and combined them into something that Victorian society was not entirely prepared for. She moved faster. She took up more space. She walked as though the street belonged to her. Because she'd decided quite deliberately that it did. The year is 1894, March to be exact. The North American Review, a prestigious journal read on both sides of the Atlantic, publishes an essay by a British writer named Sarah Grand. The essay is called The New Aspect of the Woman Question. It is not a gentle piece. Grand was not a gentle writer. She had left her husband 4 years earlier to pursue a career as an author, which was in itself a statement. And she wrote about the double standards of Victorian society, the moral rules that applied strictly to women and scarcely at all to men, with the sustained precision of someone who'd been watching the machinery of injustice operate for a long time and had finally decided to describe it in public. In that March essay, she introduced a phrase, 2 words, just 2, that crystallised something that had been accumulating in British culture for years without a name: the new woman. Within weeks, Punch magazine had made her a figure of satire. Within months, the phrase was in every newspaper in Britain. Within a year, plays had been written about her, novels, counter-essays, panicked editorials. In the way that only the best coinages do, Sarah Grand's 2 words named a thing that had already been forming, and in naming it made it more real, more visible, more impossible to dismiss. But here is what I want to talk about in this section. Not the New Woman as a literary movement, though she was one. Not the New Woman as a political idea, though she was that too. I want to talk about what the New Woman actually looked like in the street, what she was doing with her body in public space, how she moved. Because the New Woman of the 1890s was not primarily a theoretical position, she was a physical fact. And the physical fact of her was to the Victorian world perhaps more disturbing than anything she wrote or said. She was walking faster, and she was no longer doing it at twilight. Let me tell you about the safety bicycle first, because it is impossible to tell the story of the New Woman without it. The design we would recognize as a modern bicycle, 2 wheels of equal size, a chain drive, pneumatic rubber tyres was introduced in its definitive form in 1885. The earlier penny farthing with its enormous front wheel and tiny rear had been essentially impossible for women to ride in Victorian dress, and most people in Victorian dress for that matter. The safety bicycle changed everything. By the early 1890s, they were being manufactured in their millions. By 1895, the cycling craze had reached the pitch of a genuine cultural phenomenon. The Cyclist Touring Club in Britain had 60,000 members, and by some estimates, a third of them were women. Globally, somewhere between 2 and 4 million women were cycling by the mid-1890s. Think about that number for a moment. Millions of women, moving through public space at their own speed, going where they chose, returning when they decided to return, without a chaperone, without a constitutional excuse, without asking permission from anyone. The reactions were extraordinary, and I use that word specifically because some of the responses to women's cycling were so floridly panicked that they have the quality of unintentional comedy in retrospect. Medical professionals warned that cycling would damage women's reproductive organs. A doctor named Arabella Keneally, who was almost incredibly a woman herself, wrote that cycling would make women more mannish and inevitably limit their ability to have children. A vicar described in anguished detail having been subjected to the sight of ladies cycling down hills in a wind and the inevitable consequences for public decency. One female cyclist charting the progress of women's cycling in Dublin described the experience with magnificent understatement. By 1890, she wrote one could ride a bicycle around Dublin without being actually mobbed. By 1891, curses and strong epithets were only heard occasionally in the streets. Society, she noted with some amusement, still totally ignored the existence of the pastime, and society with a small letter thought it very fast and vulgar. By 1895, even members of the aristocracy had taken to cycling, which in the peculiar alchemy of Victorian social hierarchy made it simultaneously acceptable and unstoppable. But the bicycle was only part of the story. It was the most visible, most contested, most loudly argued over part. It was the thing that Punch drew cartoons about and doctors wrote alarmed papers about, and newspapers ran editorials about for years. The bicycle got all the attention, and it deserved some of it. Genuinely, the safety bicycle did change women's relationship to public space in ways that were radical and lasting. Susan B. Anthony, the great American suffragist, said in 1896 at the age of 76 that she thought bicycling had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. Elizabeth Cady Stanton at 80 added that the bicycle would inspire women with more courage, self-respect and self-reliance, and make the next generation more vigorous of mind and body. These were not marginal figures making idle compliments. These were the architects of the women's rights movement, and they were saying with complete seriousness that a wheeled vehicle had done something for women's freedom that decades of speeches and petitions had not. I do not think they were wrong, but I also think they were talking about something larger than the bicycle. The bicycle was a symbol and a tool. What it symbolized was a woman who moved through the world on her own power at her own pace, to destinations of her own choosing. What it made possible was not just faster movement, but a completely different relationship between a woman's body and the geography of the world around her. Think about what we've been discussing throughout this entire video. The middle-class woman of the 1870s and 80s navigating the twilight loophole, the careful timing, the constitutional framing, the chaperone arrangements that satisfied visible requirements, while the interior reality remained unchanged. All of that careful, patient, intelligent negotiation with a world that had decided women's bodies needed management. The new woman of the 1890s was not negotiating. She was not looking for a loophole. She was riding down the middle of the street at noon in rational dress that permitted genuine physical movement going somewhere specific, and she had a latchkey in her pocket to let herself back in when she returned. The latchkey was, by the way, one of the specific symbolic objects that Punch magazine attached to the new woman, along with the bicycle and the cigarette. The latchkey meant she did not need to be let in by someone else. She came and went at her own hour. The whole architecture of supervised female movement had simply become irrelevant to her. Now, here is where I want to introduce a complication because I have enormous affection for complexity, and the new woman is nothing if not complex. The term meant different things to different people who used it, and not all of those things were compatible. Sarah Grand's new woman was educated, politically conscious, morally rigorous. Ouida, whose real name was Maria Louise Ramée, the novelist who wrote the response to Grand's essay also in 1894, thought Grand's new woman was an insufferable prig who confused political righteousness with actual liberation. Punch's version was a cartoon, a figure of fun, cigarette smoking, and aggressive and absurd. The new woman plays being staged in London's West End in 1894, Sidney Grundy's The New Woman. Arthur Wing Pinero's earlier work presented her as comic at best and alarming at worst. Henrik Ibsen's versions, Nora in A Doll's House, Hedda in Hedda Gabler, were tragic, trapped, finally and devastatingly free but at enormous personal cost. George Bernard Shaw's new women were witty, clear-eyed, and usually right about everything, which irritated the critics enormously. And somewhere in between all these literary versions there was an actual woman. Many of them, millions of them, who did not know they were a cultural phenomenon and did not particularly care. They just wanted to go outside without asking permission. I want to tell you about one specific woman who I think captures something essential about this moment. Her name was Frances Mary Buss. She was the founder of the North London Collegiate School, established in 1851, of the first schools in England that took girls' education seriously. Not education as accomplishment, not piano and embroidery and French conversation, but education as intellectual development, the same kind of serious, rigorous training that was available to boys at comparable institutions. Buss was not a new woman in the 1890s sense of the term. She was older than that, shaped by the earlier decades we've been exploring throughout this video. But what she represents is something crucial about the line of transmission from those quiet evening walkers of the 1870s and 80s to the bicycle-riding, latchkey-carrying, Ibsen-attending women of the 1890s. That line runs through education. By 1890, women could attend Girton and Newnham colleges at Cambridge, though they could not receive degrees, a situation so absurd that in 1897, when a vote was held on whether female students should receive degrees, upon completion of their studies, students at the university celebrated the defeat of the proposal by tearing down an effigy of a woman cyclist that had been hung above the street. Women as a prop for male celebration of female exclusion. But they were in the colleges, they were studying, they were reading, and then they were walking back to their rooms in the evening on the same Cambridge streets, thinking the same thoughts, with a quality of independence in their gait that their mothers and grandmothers had had to construct across years of quiet negotiation. What the 1890s changed at its deepest level was not the law. The Married Women's Property Act, the educational reforms, the emerging debate about suffrage, those were earlier, and they mattered enormously. What the 1890s changed was something more immediate. It changed the speed, and I mean that literally as well as metaphorically. The woman of the 1870s walked at a pace that was shaped by layers of clothing weighing up to 25 pounds, by social codes that required her to appear unhurried, and contained by the knowledge that her gait and speed and direction were subject to observation and interpretation. The new woman of the 1890s was cycling, at some pace, down the middle of the street, in rational dress designed for movement, with no one's permission, and the pace mattered. Speed is not simply a practical fact. Speed is a statement about urgency, about destination, about the existence of somewhere to be. A woman moving quickly through public space was a woman with a purpose that existed outside the domestic sphere. She was going somewhere, and the somewhere was hers. There is a specific quality to the way contemporary commentators wrote about the new woman's movement in public space that I find revealing. She was described as striding, not walking, not promenading, striding. The word carries physical confidence, purposefulness, a claim on the pavement. She walked as if the street belonged to her, and the discomfort this produced in observers, the cartoons, the satirical essays, the theatrical parodies, was in large part a discomfort with the physical fact of a woman moving through space as if she had a right to be there, that required no external validation. Not a loophole, not a constitutional, not a medical prescription, just presence, just movement, just a woman going somewhere because she had decided to go there. I want to be honest about the limits of this story because I think honesty matters here. The new woman of the 1890s was, and the historical record is quite clear about this, primarily a middle-class and upper-middle-class phenomenon. The bicycle, despite being cheaper than a horse, was still a significant purchase. The rational dress reform, the bloomers, the shorter skirts, the abandoned corsets was available to women who had the income and social freedom to make wardrobe choices without consequences. The latchkey only helped if you were not expected to be home at a specific time to perform specific domestic labour. The working-class women we met in the last section were already moving through public space freely, as we discussed. The new woman's revolution was in a very precise sense a middle-class woman catching up to a freedom that working-class women had never been prevented from exercising. Which is not to diminish what the new woman represented. It is simply to be accurate about who was transformed and who had never been constrained in the same way. But there is something that the new woman did that went beyond class, something that had a consequence that rippled outward in ways that nobody quite anticipated. She made the conversation public. The negotiations we've been following throughout this video in the diaries, in the medical journals, in the etiquette books, in the quiet twilight walks, those negotiations had all been private, personal, internal. They happened in individual women's minds and in the pages of their private writing. The new woman brought them into the open. The debate about whether women had the right to occupy public space, to move at their own pace, to go to the places they chose to dress for their own physical freedom, rather than for the comfort of observers. That debate by the 1890s was happening in every newspaper in Britain, in every theatre, in every drawing room. It had become impossible to pretend the question was not being asked. And this matters for our story in a specific way, because the women who had been walking quietly at twilight since the 1870s, who had been recording their observations in diaries and returning home, opened as one of them wrote with more room inside. Those women had not been silent. They'd been preparing, building across decades the interior resources that made the next step possible. The quiet defiance of the evening walk was not a lesser form of resistance than the new woman's striding. It was the ground she walked on. It was the accumulated weight of a generation of women who had practiced in private and in small daily acts the belief that their bodies existed for their own use. And when Sarah Grand wrote her 2 words in 1894, She was naming something that those women had already been living for 20 years. Something about all of this makes me want to ask you a question, because I think there is something in this story that applies to more than the 1890s. When you think about the changes in your own life that felt most significant, the moments when something that had been impossible or forbidden or just quietly out of reach became suddenly genuinely available, did those changes usually arrive all at once? In my experience, they almost never do. They accumulate, slowly, invisibly, in the private spaces of ordinary life, until something names them, and the naming releases them. The new woman did not appear from nowhere. She stepped out of decades of evening walks, but the new woman, for all her speed and her latchkey and her magnificent disregard for curses in the Dublin streets, was still operating in a world that had rules. Rules that were changing, yes. Rules that were being contested more loudly and more publicly than before, but still rules. And the rules said something specific about where women could safely be, and where they could not. The evenings we have been celebrating throughout this video, the twilight walks the gaslit streets, the sensory world of a Victorian woman's 45 minutes of freedom. Those evenings had another quality that we have not yet fully explored. They had danger in them. Real danger. Imagined danger. The danger that was warned about constantly in etiquette books and newspaper editorials and anxious parental advice, and the danger that women actually faced, and the remarkable gap between those two things. That gap is where the next part of our story lives. There is something I keep coming back to whenever I think about Victorian women and their evening walks. Something that the historical record shows clearly, but that rarely gets talked about, because we tend to think of the walk as the destination, the 45 minutes of freedom, the constitutional, the quiet negotiation with a world that wanted them indoors. And all of that is true, but I want to suggest something else tonight. Something that I think is actually more interesting than the walk itself. What was happening inside their minds while they walked? What was being made in the silence between the footsteps and the gaslit street and the iron wheels on cobblestone? Because if you look carefully at what Victorian women produced, the novels, the poetry, the letters, the private reflections that survive in archive boxes, and if you compare that output to the walking, something begins to appear. A pattern. A connection so consistent that it cannot be coincidence. The walks were not just freedom. The walks were the workshop. Let me start with someone who is almost never discussed in the context of walking, because a story is usually told as a story of imprisonment. Elizabeth Barrett was by her own account a semi-invalid, confined to her room at 50 Wimpole Street in London for most of her 20s and 30s. She'd been seriously ill in her late teens, and her father, Edward Moulton Barrett, a man whose grip on his adult children was famously absolute, had constructed around her and around all of his children a domestic world from which departure was essentially forbidden. Elizabeth could not go out freely. She could not have visitors without permission. She could not make ordinary choices about her own daily life. By any measure of the framework we've been building in this video, she was the most constrained of all the women we have met. And yet, in those same years of confinement at Wimpole Street, she was producing poetry at a rate and quality that made her by the early 1840s one of the most admired poets in Britain. Her volume, simply titled Poems in 1844, attracted the attention of a young poet named Robert Browning, who wrote her a letter saying he loved her poems and loved her too. He had not met her. This is either extremely romantic or extremely alarming depending on your perspective, and I leave that to you to decide. But here is what I want you to notice. When Elizabeth Barrett finally did leave Wimpole Street secretly against her father's will in September 1846 to marry Browning and sail to Italy, something happened to her relationship with outdoor movement that was almost the first thing she recorded. She walked. She walked in the streets of Florence. She walked in the hills above the city. She walked in the gardens at Casa Guidi, their home, and her poetry in the years after she began walking freely changed in a way that her contemporaries noticed, and that scholars have been analysing ever since. Aurora Leigh, her great verse novel published in 1856, is a poem about a woman becoming a writer, about what a woman needs in order to think, about the relationship between physical freedom and intellectual production. Elizabeth Barrett Browning did not write it while confined to Wimpole Street. She wrote it while walking. Now I want to be careful here because I am not making a simple argument. I'm not saying that walking produces great art automatically, as if the pavement itself were a creative tool, and all you had to do was put your feet on it. What I am saying is something more specific. I am saying that for women in Victorian England, the walk was often the only time and place where the conditions for creative thought could exist, and those conditions are not mysterious. They are in fact quite well understood now. We just did not have the vocabulary to describe them until the 20th century and beyond. Researchers studying the neuroscience of creativity have identified a network of brain regions called the default mode network. It activates most powerfully not when you are concentrating on a specific task, but when your mind is allowed to wander, when you are not focused on an external demand, when your attention is free to move between memory and imagination and association without being called back to a particular problem. A Stanford University study found that walking increases creative output by an average of 60%. That number still surprises people when they hear it. 60%. Not by a little, not marginally, by more than half again. And the effect persists for several minutes after you stop walking. The brain apparently remains in a state of elevated associative thinking, even after the body has come to rest. Now here is the thing. The Victorian women who walked in the evenings had no access to functional magnetic resonance imaging. They did not know what the default mode network was. They could not cite Stanford studies. But they knew in the way that people have always known things about their own experience before science caught up to name them, that the walk did something to their thinking that nothing else did. Their diaries say it repeatedly in the plain language of observation. A walk clears the head. After a walk, things seem more arranged. I had been puzzling over something for days, and then on the evening walk it simply came clear. George Eliot walked. This requires a moment of context because George Eliot's walking was somewhat hampered by the same anxieties about female public presence that we've been discussing throughout this video. Mary Ann Evans, which was her actual name, the name she published under the pseudonym George Eliot, to avoid the critical double standard that applied to women writers, was in a particularly complicated social position. She was living from 1854 onward with a man named George Henry Lewis, who was legally still married to another woman under the laws of the time because divorce was effectively impossible. Their partnership was genuine and lasting. They were together until Lewis's death in 1878, but it placed Eliot outside the circle of respectable society in a way that made her relationship to public space peculiar. She could not attend social functions where married women were present. She could not make ordinary visits. Certain doors were closed to her by the logic of Victorian respectability. What she could do, what no one could stop her from doing, was walk. She and Lewis walked together in London. They walked in the countryside during their extended stays outside the city. And Eliot's notebooks from the period of her major novels Middlemarch began in earnest in 1869. The Mill on the Floss in 1859 are full of observations recorded during or immediately after walks, character notes, dialogue fragments, the specific detail of a face or a gesture noticed on the street, the way a particular stretch of water looked at a particular hour. Middlemarch, which Virginia Woolf would later call one of the few English novels written for grown-up people, was built largely from material gathered outdoors, Here is a question I genuinely find fascinating, and I want to put it to you. Do you think the thinking you do when you are moving, walking somewhere, on a long drive, in the shower, those liminal spaces where your hands are occupied but your mind is not, do you think that thinking is different from the thinking you do when you're deliberately sitting down to solve a problem? I am asking because I suspect the answer for most people is yes. And if the answer is yes, then what Victorian women were doing during their evening walks was not just escaping the house. They were accessing a particular quality of thought, one that the house, with its structured duties, its social performances, its constant demand on attention, specifically prevented. Let me tell you about Christina Rossetti. She is the Victorian poet I find most interesting to think about in this context, partly because her relationship with outdoor movement was so constrained, and partly because what she produced despite those constraints is so extraordinary. Rossetti was a deeply devout Anglican. Her faith shaped every aspect of her life, including her relationship to her own body and its needs and freedoms. She declined on religious grounds a serious proposal of marriage. She resigned from a planned trip to Italy because she was not comfortable with the moral reputation of a fellow traveller. She was not someone who pushed against social constraint in the way that the new woman of the 1890s would. And yet, her poetry is full of movement, full of walking, full of roads and paths and journeys and the particular quality of light at different hours of the day. Goblin Market, published in 1862, is structured entirely as a journey. Two sisters. A path. The choice of whether to leave that path. The consequences. The way back. Scholars have debated for decades what Goblin Market is really about. Temptation, sisterhood, commerce, desire. And the answer is probably all of those things and more. But what nobody debates is this: the poem moves. It has a walker's rhythm, a pedestrian urgency. It understands the particular consciousness that comes from being in motion, in a world that is pressing its sensations against you from all sides. Rossetti wrote it by her own account while walking in the garden of a women's refuge, where she volunteered on and off for a decade beginning in 1860. Not on an evening constitutional through the London streets, in a garden, a limited space, but moving. There is something I want to be honest about here. The connection between walking and creative thought in Victorian women's lives was not a secret or a discovery. The women themselves knew about it. They talked about it. They recommended it to each other. Elizabeth Gaskell, who wrote North and South and Mary Barton, and the biography of Charlotte Brontë that remains one of the best literary lives in the English language, wrote in her letters about walking as a deliberate part of her writing process. She had 6 children and a demanding husband and a household to manage, and she wrote her novels in conditions of interruption that most writers today would find impossible. But she walked. Specifically, she walked when she was stuck, when a chapter would not resolve itself, when a character was not behaving as required. She went out. She walked until something shifted. She came back. She wrote. This is not romantic myth. This is practical methodology, and it was shared across a community of women writers who were in a sense developing a working practice entirely without institutional support, without writing residencies or grants or professional infrastructures of any kind, by finding the cognitive tools that were available to them within the constraints of their actual lives. The evening walk was not just freedom. It was for many of them the closest thing they had to an office. Now let me introduce someone who makes this whole argument concrete in a very specific way. Her name is Anne Brontë. She's of all the Brontë sisters the one whose reputation has suffered most from comparison with her siblings. Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre. Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. These are not modest achievements to be overshadowed by, but Anne wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall in 1848. which is by any serious critical measure one of the most radical novels of the Victorian period. It is the story of a woman who leaves her husband, not metaphorically, actually leaves, takes her child, packs her belongings, moves out. In 1848, when a woman doing this was not only socially impossible, but as we discussed in part 1 of this video, legally complicated in ways that made the act genuinely extraordinary. The novel was so radical that Charlotte Bronte, after Anne's death, prevented it from being reprinted. She thought it too much. Anne Bronte wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall at Haworth Parsonage on the edge of the Yorkshire moors. She walked those moors her entire life. From childhood, all 3 of the Bronte sisters walked the moors compulsively in all weathers, for long distances, often at hours when the social rules about female outdoor presence were at their most relaxed. In the evenings, in early morning, in the rain which the moors provide in abundance. Their writing is saturated with that landscape, its specific light, its particular quality of wind, its capacity to make a person feel simultaneously very small and very free. And I think something specific happened to Anne Bronte on those walks that is worth naming. She was by temperament the quietest of the 3 sisters, the most inward. Charlotte was fierce and volcanic. Emily was difficult and private in a way that resists easy description. Anne was gentle, observant, morally serious. She watched things carefully. She let what she saw accumulate, and then she walked with it. And what she brought back from those walks was a clarity about human behaviour and its consequences that is in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall genuinely startling in its steadiness. The novel does not rage. It observes. It records. It follows the logic of events to where they lead without flinching. That kind of thinking, careful, sustained, honest, requires time without interruption. It requires a mind that has been allowed to process what it has observed without immediately being called back to a domestic task. The walk gave Anne Bronte that time, every evening, in the wind off the moors, one last thing before we move on, and it is something that I think matters for how we understand our own lives as much as it matters for understanding theirs. The creativity produced on those Victorian evening walks was not always destined for publication. It was not always writing. It was not always anything that left a visible record. For every George Eliot or Anne Bronte who turned what she gathered on her walks into a novel that changed how people thought about women and freedom, there were thousands of women whose creative thought during evening walks went into a letter to a friend or a better conversation at dinner or a decision about their own life that nobody recorded but that shaped everything that followed. The Cambridge Diary research we've been drawing on throughout this video found that women recorded their walks with a matter-of-fact consistency that suggests they knew at some level that the walk was doing something necessary. Not something recreational, not an indulgence, something the mind required in order to work properly. And they were right. The neuroscience confirms what those Victorian women knew in their bodies before the language existed to describe it. The mind that has been permitted to wander along a gaslit street past a baker's cooling window, through the amber pools of Victorian fog with no one watching, and no social performance required, that mind comes home different, wider, more arranged, carrying something it did not have when it left the house, and that something multiplied across millions of women over the span of decades produced an enormous and largely uncatalogued contribution to Victorian thought and culture. The unwritten novels, the letters that changed a friend's mind, the decisions that changed a daughter's future, the quiet accumulation of a generation of women who walked and thought and came back knowing more than they had left with. But here is where I have to be honest about the limits of the freedom the walk provided. Because the walk was in the end still bounded. It happened in a particular time, a particular place, under particular conditions. And the world that Victorian women were walking through was not uniformly welcoming. It had specific and documented dangers, some real, some imagined, some deliberately exaggerated by people who wanted women to stay indoors, and the relationship between those real dangers and the imagined ones in the way that fear was used as a tool to limit female movement. That is a story that is more complicated and more interesting than the simple narrative of danger and warning would suggest. That is where we're going next. There is something quietly fascinating about fear. Not the fear itself, but who manufactures it, and why, and what it keeps people from doing. Because throughout this entire video, we've been watching Victorian women navigate a world that was constantly, insistently telling them the street was dangerous. That being outside after dark was a risk no respectable woman should take. That the responsible thing, the safe thing, was to stay home. And I want to spend some time with that warning, not to dismiss it entirely. Real dangers existed in Victorian streets, and I will not pretend otherwise, but I want to look at the gap, the specific documented gap between the danger that was real and the danger that was performed, advertised, and deliberately amplified, because that gap is, I think, one of the most revealing things about the entire world these women inhabited. Let us start with the garrotting panic of 1862. Garrotting, if you're not familiar with it, was a method of street robbery where an attacker would approach from behind and apply pressure to the throat, temporarily incapacitating the victim while an accomplice robbed them. It happened. People were garroted. It was genuinely unpleasant and occasionally serious. But here is what the historical record also shows quite clearly. In 1862, after a Member of Parliament named James Pilkington was garroted while walking from the House of Commons to his club at 1 a.m, which is, I would gently observe, rather a different situation from a middle-class woman taking an evening constitutional at twilight. The British press entered a state of competitive catastrophizing that lasted for years. The Daily News described London as a lair of footpads and assassins by night. The Times declared that whole areas of the city were no-go zones, where respectable people faced imminent danger of being throttled and robbed. Sensational press comparisons claimed the Bayswater Road was now as unsafe as Naples. Londoners began purchasing spiked collars, cravats with razor blades sewn into them, and various other anti-garroting devices that Punch magazine satirized with considerable glee. And then the Shoreditch Advertiser rather admirably, I think, actually investigated the cases being reported in its district. It found not one verifiable case of garrotting among numerous reports. Every single one turned out to be, in its phrase, utterly fictitious or a mere drunken squabble. Reynolds's newspaper called the whole affair a load of fuss and bother based on clubhouse panic. The Daily News itself, the same paper that had called London a lair of assassins, issued cautionary comments about wild, excited talk and exaggerated and fictitious stories. The official crime figures showed that crime in London had generally been falling since the Metropolitan Police was established in 1829. The streets were, by the evidence, getting safer. The newspapers were making them sound more dangerous. This is the context in which etiquette books and anxious voices warned Victorian women not to walk alone at night. Some of those warnings were genuine, some were well-intentioned, and some, and this is what I find genuinely interesting, were whether consciously or not doing the work of keeping women indoors. Because here is the mechanism, and it is not subtle once you see it. A woman who believes the street is overwhelmingly dangerous will not go outside. A woman who does not go outside will not develop the habit of outdoor independence. A woman who does not develop that habit will remain available for the management, supervision, and social performance that the domestic sphere required of her. The warning served the system, not because every person who issued it was cynical, but because the warning was structurally convenient. Now, August 1888, the Whitechapel murders. And here I want to be very careful, because this is a story that has been told badly, and often with exactly the kind of sensationalism that fueled the original panic. Between the 31st of August and the 9th of November, 1888, 5 women were killed in Whitechapel in the East End of London. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. These were real women, not symbols, not narrative props. They had families, they had histories. They had been failed comprehensively by a society that offered no safety net to women in the circumstances they found themselves in, circumstances shaped by failed marriages, poverty, the loss of children, and a labour market that paid women less than half of what it paid men for the same work. They were not killed because they were walking. They were killed because they were vulnerable in a specific location at specific hours in conditions of extreme social precarity. The lessons historians have drawn from their deaths have often been wrong. Judith Wolkowitz, in her landmark study City of Dreadful Delight, argues powerfully and correctly that the Ripper story was not primarily a story about street danger. It was a story that Victorian newspapers and Victorian culture seized upon and used quite specifically to generate fear amongst women who were claiming public space. The cultural historian's analysis is pointed far from prompting social reform or improving conditions for East End women. The media coverage of the Ripper murders became a disciplinary mechanism. Women of the respectable middle class were told again that the street was not safe for them, that the sensible, the responsible, the feminine response to the world was to withdraw, to stay inside, to let the men manage the public world. The Ripper panic did not stop women from walking, but it tried. What strikes me most when I think about this whole history is the patience, the quiet iron patience of ordinary Victorian women who walked anyway, who assessed the actual risk as distinct from the manufactured version and made their own calculations. The Cambridge Diary research we have drawn on throughout this video found consistently that women did not record their solitary walks with anxiety about physical danger. They recorded them matter-of-factly. They noted what they saw. They described what they thought. They came home and wrote it down. These were not reckless women. They were not ignoring the warnings out of naivety. They were intelligent, observant people who had looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion that the evidence actually supported that a middle-class woman walking in her own neighbourhood at twilight was not in the kind of danger the newspapers were describing. And they were right. I want to be honest here because this is a story that deserves honesty. The danger was not equally distributed. The working-class women of the East End, the women we met in part 8 of this video, the women who had no choice about being in the street at late hours because that was where their work was and where their lives were, those women faced real risks that their middle-class counterparts did not. The Ripper's victims were not killed because they walked. They were killed because they were poor, because they were without protection, and because the society they lived in had decided their lives were worth less than respectable women's lives. That is a different kind of danger, a systemic one. And it sat uncomfortable and largely unacknowledged alongside the middle-class woman's twilight constitutional. The same streets, very different vulnerabilities. So what did Victorian women actually ignore? They ignored the etiquette books that told them no respectable woman should be seen in the street unaccompanied after a certain hour. They ignored the medical voices that warned outdoor air at night was bad for delicate constitutions, which was itself a fiction as we discussed in part 7. They ignored the anxious social pressure that suggested a woman's presence in public after dark was an implicit statement about her character. They ignored with a particular kind of steady courage the implication that they needed to be afraid of a world that was mostly for them quite safe. And in doing so they preserved something, a habit of presence, a practice of independent movement through space, a daily embodied reminder that the world outside the domestic sphere was theirs too. not because anyone had given it to them, but because they had walked out into it and come back evening after evening with nothing worse than muddy hems and full minds. This is where we arrive at the last question this whole video has been building toward. What did they leave us? What does it mean right now tonight that millions of Victorian women spent decades navigating this particular negotiation between the world's insistence on their confinement and their own quiet, persistent refusal? I have been thinking about this for a long time, and here is what I keep coming back to. The Victorian evening walk was not in the end about the walk. It was about the insistence on a self that existed outside its assigned role. The woman who put on her coat and walked out the door was not making a political statement in most cases. She was not a hero of suffrage or a symbol of liberation, or a new woman striding into a century of change. She was just a person who needed 45 minutes of air and movement, and the specific quality of thought that comes from being in motion in the world. But in needing it, and claiming it, and protecting it across decades in which 100 different voices told her it was unnecessary, or improper, or dangerous, she was doing something that mattered. She was practicing the belief that her inner life was real, that her need for space to think was as legitimate as anyone else's need, that the world outside the house was not a reward or a concession or a supervised excursion. It was hers. She'd been born into it, and she had every right to walk through it. Think about what was built on that foundation. The women who walked quietly at twilight in the 1870s and 80s became the mothers and aunts and teachers of the women who in the 1890s and 1900s and 1910s campaigned openly for the vote, who stood on street corners and gave speeches, who marched in public in daylight in large numbers through the very streets their mothers had learned to move through one at a time at dusk in ones and twos. The suffrage marches of the early 20th century were not possible without the generation that came before. The women who had practiced outdoor independence in small private acts, who had learned to move through public space without permission, who had proven to themselves evening by evening that the street did not swallow them, that the world outside the domestic sphere was survivable, even sometimes beautiful, even often necessary. There is a detail from the Cambridge Diary research that I've been saving for the end. It is small, but it has stayed with me since I first read it. One of the diarists, a woman whose name we do not know with certainty, only her initials recorded her evening walks over the course of several years in the 1880s. She noted what she saw, the weather, the light, occasionally what she was thinking about, and at the end of one entry after a walk in November she wrote something that stopped me. She wrote, "I came home better." 3 words, no explanation of what she had been before the walk or what better meant or what had shifted. Just "I came home better." And I think that is the whole story, really. That is what the Victorian evening walk was. Not a revolution, not a manifesto, not a movement with a name and a pamphlet and a membership fee. Just a woman who went outside and came home better, repeated across millions of lives, across decades, accumulated into something that changed the world slowly from the inside out. We have been walking with these women for a long time tonight, through gaslit streets and twilight loopholes, through corsets and constitutionals, through the sensory world of Victorian evenings, and the unequal geography of Clares through the new woman's bicycle, and the creative workshops of the evening road through manufactured fear and quiet courage, and the small daily act of putting on a coat and going outside. And I find myself arriving at the end of this story with something that feels less like a conclusion and more like a kind of gratitude. Gratitude for the women who kept those diaries, who wrote down without drama or self-importance what they saw and thought and felt on their evening walks, who preserved in the simplest possible language evidence that they existed, that they were not merely what their century expected them to be, that they were curious and observant and alive to the world in ways that the domestic sphere did not provide for, that they went outside and came home better. If you have made it to the end of this video all the way through this long, slow journey into the Victorian evening, then I want to say something to you directly. Thank you. Not the formal kind of thank you, the genuine kind. Because the fact that you are here at this hour willing to sit with a story this quiet and this particular tells me something about you. You are the kind of person who finds meaning in the detail of other people's lives, who understands that the history that matters most is not always the history with the loudest voice, that a woman walking at dusk alone thinking her own thoughts, that this is worth knowing about, worth honouring, worth carrying forward. So if there is something you have been putting off, walking toward a thought you've been waiting for the right moment to think a question, you've been too busy to ask yourself, take a walk this week. Not for fitness, not to get anywhere, just to come home better. I would love to know what stayed with you from this video, which woman's story surprised you most, or whether you have a walking habit of your own, and whether it does for you what it did for these women. Leave it in the comments. I read them all. And if stories like this one are the kind of thing you want more of, slow, deep historical told at the hour when the world gets quiet, then subscribe so I can keep making them for you. There are more evenings to walk through, more lives to sit with, more stories that history almost let slip away. I will have another one ready for you soon. Sleep well.